On September 21st, 2020, Deion Sanders was introduced as the 21st head football coach of Jackson State University. And to understand why that date matters, you have to understand the atmospheric conditions of America at that exact moment. Because what Deion Sanders did was not merely accept a coaching position. What he did was read the room of an entire civilization and position himself inside its most volatile emotional frequency. He saw the signal before anyone else could name it, and he didn't just respond to it. He became the signal. He didn't enter a conversation. He became the conversation. And that distinction, the difference between participating in a cultural moment and architecting one, is the difference between a very good career move and one of the most sophisticated operations of narrative capture in the history of American sports. Let's rewind. George Floyd was murdered on May 25th, 2020. By June of that year, an estimated 15 to 26 million people had participated in Black Lives Matter protests across the United States, making it potentially the largest protest movement in American history. The cultural temperature of America in summer 2020 was unlike anything most living people had experienced. There was a kind of collective psychic rupture happening, a moment where the vocabulary of racial oppression went from something that existed on the margins of mainstream discourse to something that saturated every institution, every boardroom, every locker room, every dinner table. Corporate America was issuing statements. The NFL, the same league that had effectively blackballed Colin Kaepernick for kneeling during the national anthem, suddenly released a video where Roger Goodell said, quote, "We were wrong for not listening to NFL players earlier. Universities were renaming buildings. Statues were being toppled. Quaker Oats retired Aunt Jemima. Mars retired Uncle Ben. Dixie Beer became Faubourg. The linguistic and symbolic inventory of American commerce was being frantically reorganized in real time, not because corporations had undergone a moral awakening, but because the attention economy had identified racial reckoning as a temporary risk category that required aesthetic mitigation. And in the middle of this tectonic cultural shift, something very specific was happening in the Black American imagination that nobody has adequately dissected. What was happening was this. For the first time in a generation, there was a mass-scale emotional reckoning with the extractive relationship between predominantly white institutions and black talent. This wasn't new intellectually. Scholars like Harry Edwards had been writing about the exploitation of black athletes since the 1960s. William Rhoden's book, $40 Million Slaves, had mapped the economic architecture of how black athletic labor gets converted into white institutional wealth. Richard Lapchick at the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport had been publishing the Racial and Gender Report Card for decades, documenting the persistent disparities between the demographics of players and the demographics of coaches, executives, and owners. Billy Hawkins' book, The New Plantation, had extended this analysis to the college level, examining how predominantly white institutions function as extraction sites for black athletic labor that is converted into university revenue, coaching salaries, and administrative infrastructure without producing commensurate returns for the athletes themselves. This scholarship existed. The data was unambiguous. But in summer 2020, this wasn't an academic argument anymore. It was a feeling. It was in the air. It was in the Instagram posts and the Twitter threads and the group chats. There was a pervasive, almost subcutaneous awareness spreading through Black America that something was fundamentally broken about the pipeline, that the relationship between black bodies, black talent, black excellence, and the institutions that house them was not symbiotic. It was parasitic. And for the first time in decades, millions of people who had never read Harry Edwards or William Rhoden were arriving at the same conclusions through the pure accumulated weight of lived observation, filtered through a social media ecosystem that was collapsing the distance between private grievance and collective consciousness. And this is the atmospheric condition into which Deion Sanders inserted himself, not as a coach, as a symbol, as a spectacle, as a narrative technology, because Sanders did not hire a public relations firm and run focus groups and commission polling and then decide that Jackson State was the optimal brand positioning. That's not how this worked. What happened was more subtle and more powerful. Sanders, who had spent 35 years in the spotlight of professional sports and who had cultivated one of the most distinctive personal brands in American athletic history, possessed a kind of pre-rational sensitivity to cultural frequency. He didn't calculate the racial moment, he felt it. In his entire career, from his primetime persona in the 1980s to his Neon Deion marketing campaigns to his post-retirement media work to his coaching at Trinity Christian High School, had been a continuous training regimen in the art of reading the room and adjusting his positioning to whatever the current moment demanded. By the time 2020 arrived, Sanders had 35 years of accumulated intuition about what would register with the American public and what wouldn't. Jackson State registered. It registered hard. And Sanders walked through the door that the moment had opened for him with the fluency of someone who had been rehearsing this move subconsciously for his entire professional life. Now, here's what most people miss about the Sanders to Jackson State move, and this is the part that requires you to hold two competing ideas in your head simultaneously. The first idea is that there is a real, legitimate, historically grounded argument for investing in HBCUs. Historically, black colleges and universities have produced 70% of black dentists and physicians, 80% of black judges, and 50% of black engineers and public school teachers. Despite representing only 3% of American colleges and universities, HBCUs account for 17% of bachelor's degrees earned by black Americans and 24% of bachelor's degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields earned by black Americans. The HBCU as an institution is not a symbol. It is a machine. It produces outcomes. And the argument that elite black athletic talent should flow toward these institutions rather than away from them is not frivolous. It has economic logic, it has cultural logic, and it has strategic logic. If you redirect even a fraction of the television revenue, the booster money, the NIL deals, and the NFL pipeline attention that currently flows to SEC and Big Ten football programs toward HBCU programs, you could fundamentally restructure the economic geography of black higher education. Consider the numbers. The Southeastern Conference's television deal with ESPN is worth approximately $3 billion over 10 years. The entire Southwestern Athletic Conference, home to Jackson State, generates revenue in the low tens of millions annually. This is a ratio of roughly 100 to 1. A 10% redirection of SEC-level media attention and revenue toward SWAC programs would represent a tenfold increase in SWAC program capacity. The theoretical upside of a successful HBCU investment strategy is enormous, and the emotional logic is equally compelling. Black institutions, built by black people, sustained by black alumni, producing black professionals, deserve access to the economic engine of big-time college athletics that has historically been denied to them by the segregation-era architecture of conference realignment and television contracts. That's the first idea. And it's a good one. It's not just politically correct. It's strategically and economically defensible on the merits. The second idea, the one that nobody wants to say out loud, is that Deion Sanders was never actually building that. What Deion Sanders was building was a personal brand narrative that used the emotional energy of the HBCU movement as fuel. And the evidence for this is not ambiguous. It's structural. It's in the timeline. It's in the decisions. It's in where his attention went and where it didn't go. And most importantly, it's in where he ended up. Because here's the crucial distinction that gets erased in every breathless media profile of the Sanders era at Jackson State. Building an institutional investment strategy and building a personal brand narrative that happens to reference institutional investment are not the same thing. They can look identical from the outside, especially in the short term, especially during the ascending phase of the narrative arc, but they diverge sharply at the moment of decision. At the moment when staying requires sacrificing personal upside and leaving requires abandoning the institutional partners, every performer eventually reaches that moment, and the decision they make at that moment reveals what the performance was actually for. Consider the timeline. Sanders is hired at Jackson State in September 2020. He posts a 4-3 record in his first abbreviated season, and in spring 2021, a COVID-delayed schedule. Then in fall 2021, the program goes 11-1, wins the SWAC championship, and plays in the Celebration Bowl. This is the season where the narrative machine really starts humming. Attendance at Jackson State home games spikes to an average of over 42,000 fans, setting an FCS record. The city of Jackson, Mississippi's official tourism organization, estimates that JSU football had a $30 million economic impact on the city in 2021, nearly double the $16 million from 2019. Merchandise is flying off shelves, sponsors are lining up, Barstool Sports is involved. CEMAC Entertainment, the management company co-founded by Michael Strahan, is orchestrating media strategy. Procter & Gamble, through Walmart, signs on as a corporate partner. ESPN begins treating Jackson State games as priority broadcasts. AFLAC runs commercials featuring Sanders. The Home Depot commissions coaching tree campaigns. Every major brand category with an African-American consumer strategy begins funneling activation dollars toward the program, not because they care about HBCU football, but because Jackson State has become a vehicle for reaching an engaged black consumer audience at a moment when that audience is experiencing heightened collective emotional identification with black institutional visibility. The program, in other words, is functioning as a media property, a content platform, a distribution channel for brand messaging, and the value of that platform is being harvested by Sanders, personally, by SMAC Entertainment professionally, and by the media partners who have invested in the narrative. The university itself, Jackson State as an institution, captures only a fraction of the value being generated. The rest flows to the celebrity, the management company, and the media ecosystem that surrounds them. And then, on December 15th, 2021, the nuclear bomb drops. Travis Hunter, the consensus #1 overall recruit in the class of 2022, a 5-star cornerback and wide receiver out of Collins Hill High School in Suwanee, Georgia, flips his commitment from Florida State to Jackson State. not to Alabama, not to Georgia, not to Clemson, to Jackson State, an FCSH BCU in Jackson, Mississippi. The number one player in the entire country chose to play at a school that finished 4-8 the season before Deion arrived. Steve Wiltfong, the director of national recruiting for 247 Sports, called it the biggest signing day moment in the history of college football. And he was right. No event in the modern recruiting era has produced a comparable gap between the recruit's ranking and the program's recruiting profile. Hunter's decision was, in pure information theoretic terms, maximally surprising. It was a low probability event, the kind of event whose occurrence signals that something in the underlying conditions has changed in ways that the priors had not accounted for. Which is another way of saying that Hunter's decision generated maximum narrative yield per event. Every additional unit of surprise translated into additional units of media coverage, additional units of social media engagement, and additional units of brand equity accruing to the individual at the center of the surprise. That individual was Sanders, not Hunter. Sanders, as the coaching figure whose presence had caused the surprise, captured the lion's share of the attention economy's response. Hunter was the vehicle, Sanders was the destination, and the black internet lost its collective mind. The narrative that crystallized was powerful and intoxicating. This was progress. This was a paradigm shift. This was the beginning of a new era where elite black talent would choose to invest in black institutions rather than serve as labor for white ones. The emotional resonance of this narrative was so powerful that it became almost impossible to interrogate. Anyone who questioned the strategic logic of Hunter's decision was framed as a hater, a pessimist, or worse, someone who didn't believe in the capacity of black institutions. The narrative became self-policing. It created its own immune system against criticism, and this self-policing function is a characteristic feature of manufactured spectacle in the racial register. Because the spectacle is wrapped in legitimate historical grievance and authentic collective aspiration, any attempt to separate the performance from the substance gets coded as an attack on the grievance and the aspiration themselves. The performer becomes functionally immune to critique because critiquing the performance reads as critiquing the thing the performance is allegedly in service of. This is an extraordinarily valuable position to occupy. Sanders occupied it with a precision that cannot have been accidental, given his 35 years of career experience managing the relationship between his personal brand and the collective black imagination that he has always understood himself to represent. But here's the thing about narratives that are designed to be emotionally unimpeachable. They're usually hiding something. And what this narrative was hiding was the fact that Deion Sanders had essentially created a one-man extraction economy of his own. He wasn't building Jackson State into a sustainable powerhouse. He was using Jackson State as a launchpad. He was accruing cultural capital, media attention, coaching credentials, and a roster of transferable talent that he could take with him when the right offer came along. And the right offer came along in December 2022 when he was named head coach at the University of Colorado, a Power 5, predominantly white institution. And he didn't just leave, he took his players with him. Shadir Sanders, his quarterback's son, Shiloh Sanders, his safety son, and Travis Hunter, the crown jewel of the entire HBCU movement narrative, who entered the transfer portal the moment Sanders left and followed him to Boulder. The optics of this sequence are devastating when you examine them without the protective coating of the narrative. A Hall of Fame black coach takes an HBCU job, accumulates unprecedented attention for the program, recruits the number one player in the country to the program under the explicit framing that this represents a reinvestment of black talent in black institutions, and then, at the first available opportunity, leaves that HBCU for a predominantly white institution and physically transports the recruited talent with him. The institutional residue left at Jackson State is attendance figures from years past, a trophy case from 2 SWAC championships, and the memory of a coach who once stood on the sideline. The personal residue accumulated by Sanders is a 5-year, $29.5 million contract at Colorado, a nationally televised platform in a Power 5 conference, and the continued ability to deploy the HBCU chapter of his biography as ambient credibility for whatever his next brand position requires. The entire mythology of the HBCU pipeline revolution lasted exactly 2 years, and when it was over, the net effect on Jackson State's long-term institutional capacity was negligible compared to the cultural capital that Sanders personally extracted from the experience. The attendance dropped, the national spotlight dimmed, the recruits stopped coming, the Barstool Sports partnership evaporated, the ESPN priority broadcasting slots returned to Power 5 programs, the Procter & Gamble activation dollars redirected to other vehicles, and Jackson State was left with a coaching vacancy, TC, Taylor stepping in as the replacement, and the fading afterimage of a spectacle that had never been designed to last. In 2023, the season after Sanders left, Jackson State finished 7-4, respectable, competent, invisible to the national conversation. The infrastructure that had generated $30 million of economic impact in 2021 had been revealed as essentially one person, one narrative, one moment. When the person left, the narrative ended, and the moment passed. Everything reverted to the status quo ante. The machine that had appeared to be generating institutional transformation had in fact been generating personal brand equity for Sanders, using the institution as its operating platform. The platform was disposable, the equity was portable, and once the equity had been harvested, the platform was abandoned. This is not a critique of Deion Sanders' intelligence, quite the opposite. This is an analysis of one of the most sophisticated media and cultural operations in the history of American sports. Sanders understood something that most coaches, most executives, most strategists never grasp. He understood that in a media-saturated culture, the narrative about what you're doing is more powerful than what you're actually doing. He understood that in a moment of racial reckoning, the symbolism of a black celebrity choosing a black institution would generate more media coverage, more emotional investment, and more brand equity than any number of wins and losses. He understood that the black American imagination, starved for images of institutional self-determination, would project onto his career move a significance that far exceeded its structural reality. And he understood, perhaps most importantly, that he would not be held accountable for the gap between the projected significance and the structural reality, because the same emotional dynamics that produced the projection would prevent the accountability. The audience that had invested the energy in building the narrative could not, without admitting its own complicity, turn around and critique the narrative's failure to deliver structural change. And so the audience, by the mechanics of its own emotional investment, became an enforcement mechanism for the continued protection of the performer. And this is where we have to be precise about what happened. Because what happened was not a con. It was something more subtle and more troubling than a con. A con requires deception. What Sanders did required only omission. He never said he was staying at Jackson State forever. He never said he was building a permanent pipeline. He never said he wouldn't leave for a better opportunity. He simply allowed the collective black imagination to fill in those blanks, and then he moved on when the calculus shifted. The emotional labor of constructing the narrative of permanence, of revolution, of institutional transformation was done entirely by the audience, the fans, the media, the social media commentators who wanted so desperately to believe that something structural was changing. Sanders just showed up, did his job, did it well, generated enormous attention, and left. In the technical vocabulary of contract law, Sanders committed no fraud. He made no misrepresentations. He breached no explicit promises. But in the moral vocabulary of collective trust, he executed an extraction that extracted value from a community that had invested its hopes in a vehicle whose portability he had never disguised and whose eventual departure he had never foreclosed. The community wanted a revolution. Sanders offered a performance. The community, desperate for the revolution, rated the performance as the revolution. And Sanders, having completed the performance, moved to the next stage, leaving the community to reconcile its aspirations with the material fact that the performer had departed and the stage had been struck. And the reason this matters, the reason this is the opening section of a 20-part essay and not a footnote, is that the Sanders-Jackson State to Colorado pipeline is a microcosm of something much larger. It's a case study in how spectacle operates as a substitute for structure, how emotional resonance can be manufactured and deployed to obscure the absence of institutional change, how the black American desire for self-determination can be weaponized as a marketing strategy by the very people who appear to be serving it. And most importantly, it's a case study in how football, more than any other American institution, functions as a laboratory for these dynamics. Because football is not just a sport. Football is a context machine. And the person who controls the context controls the reality. The coach decides who plays. The coach decides what scheme to run. The coach decides which players receive the narrative amplification that converts competent performance into perceived transcendence. The coach decides which recruits to pursue and which ones to pass on. And in the modern college football ecosystem, where NIL dollars and transfer portal fluidity have collapsed the distinction between coach and institution, the coach also effectively decides which institutions get access to which talent pools and which ones don't. Sanders operationalized this power with more sophistication than any coach before him. He treated the institution as a vehicle and the players as transferable assets and the narrative as the true product being sold to the audience. And the audience, because it wanted the narrative to be true, did not scrutinize the structure, until the structure revealed itself, inevitably, at the moment of departure. That's what this entire series is about. The alchemy of context, the manufacture of transcendence, the system-level mechanics of how coaches, media, formations, and cultural narratives combine to transform competent athletes into mythological figures. And it starts with Deion Sanders, because Deion Sanders understood this alchemy better than anyone in the history of the sport. Not because he was the best coach, not because he had the best players, but because he understood that in football, as in life, what you are matters less than what people believe you are. And belief in America is the most valuable currency there is. Over the next 19 sections, we're going to follow the architecture of this belief system, piece by piece, from the ground up. We're going to examine how specific coaching decisions, specific system designs, specific formations, specific media apparatuses, and specific cultural moments combine to produce the outputs we call greatness. We are going to dismantle the mythology of individual athletic transcendence and replace it with a structural model that accounts for the observable evidence. And by the end, when we arrive at the unified theory that connects Deion Sanders to Bobby Petrino, to Lamar Jackson, to Travis Hunter, to Derrick Henry, to Reggie Bonifant, to Mikey Williams, you will not be able to watch a football game the same way ever again. You will see the machinery behind the myth. You will see the context behind the competence. You will see the gatekeeping behind the greatness. And you will understand why the most important person on any football field is almost never visible to the cameras. It is the person who decided, before the cameras ever turned on, what the cameras would be pointed at and what they would be shown. That person is the coach. That person is the narrative architect. That person, in this case, was Deion Sanders. And the story of what he built, what he extracted, and what he left behind is the story of how 21st century American spectacle actually works. Before Travis Hunter ever committed to Jackson State, there was a proof of concept. There was a test case that demonstrated, in real time, the extraordinary power of even hinting at the idea of elite black talent redirecting itself toward historically black institutions. And that test case was a 15-year-old basketball player named Mikey Williams, who, on a Tuesday in June 2020, sent out an 8-word tweet that nearly broke the internet. The tweet read, quote, "Going to an HBCU wouldn't be too bad." 8 words. That's all it took. 8 words dropped into the atmospheric conditions of summer 2020, exactly 2 weeks after the George Floyd murder, exactly as the Black Lives Matter protests were reaching their historical peak, exactly at the moment when the Black American collective consciousness was most saturated with the vocabulary and the emotional architecture of institutional self-determination. 8 words that cost nothing to compose and required no follow-through to be published. 8 words that generated more press coverage, more social media engagement, more institutional attention for historically black colleges than most formally funded HBCU marketing campaigns had achieved in decades of patient institutional effort. And the disproportion between the effort invested and the attention generated is the single most important data point in understanding what actually happened here, what it meant, and what it revealed about the structural mechanics of manufactured movement in the 21st century attention economy. To understand why those 8 words mattered, you have to understand who Mikey Williams was at that exact moment and what ecosystem he was embedded in. Williams was, at the time, arguably the most famous high school basketball player in America. Not the most talented necessarily. There were players with higher recruiting rankings. Evan Mobley was higher ranked. Chet Holmgren was higher ranked. Paolo Banchero was higher ranked. But fame in the social media era is not a function of talent. It's a function of visibility multiplied by narrative timing, multiplied by distribution network access. And Mikey Williams had all 3 in a combination that made him functionally unique in the high school basketball ecosystem. He had the visibility because he was a prolific dunker with telegenic highlights and a charismatic on-court presence that translated well to short-form video. He had the narrative timing because he had emerged into public consciousness at the precise moment when Instagram and TikTok were transitioning from adjunct marketing channels to primary media distribution platforms. And he had the distribution network access because he was embedded in the most powerful content ecosystem in all of American basketball, the North Coast Blue Chips AAU organization that also housed Bronny James, LeBron's eldest son, which meant that every Williams highlight was distributed not just through Williams' own channels, but through the entire LeBron James media apparatus, which at that time reached an audience of hundreds of millions across every platform where black cultural content was consumed. Williams had risen to national prominence through a combination of genuinely electric basketball highlights and a social media savvy that was almost preternatural for his age. He had over 1 million Instagram followers before he played a single high school game. Let that fact settle for a moment. Before any actual high school basketball game, Williams had a social media audience comparable to starting NBA players. By the end of his freshman year at San Ysidro High School in San Diego, where he averaged nearly 30 points per game and was named Max Prep's National Freshman of the Year, he had nearly 2 million followers. His following included Drake, LeBron James, and Kevin Durant. He was not just a basketball player. He was a content ecosystem. He was a distribution node in a networked media environment where attention itself had become the primary economic unit, more valuable than traditional currency and more portable than physical capital. And the strategic implications of possessing that kind of distribution capacity at 15 years old, in a society that had systematically underinvested in black economic infrastructure, meant that Williams was sitting on a resource whose value his community instinctively understood, even if the formal vocabulary for that understanding had not yet been developed in mainstream discourse. But here's the detail that most people either don't know or have forgotten. And it's the detail that makes the HBCU tweet make strategic sense rather than purely ideological sense. Before Mikey Williams was famous on his own, he was famous because of proximity. Specifically, proximity to Bronny James, the eldest son of LeBron James. In 8th grade, Williams joined the North Coast Blue Chips, an AAU team, where he played alongside Bronny. LeBron James himself was a presence on the sidelines, coaching, leading huddles, participating in warm-up drills, dunking in pregame shoot-arounds, and turning what should have been a routine middle school basketball tournament into a content event with televisual production values and celebrity magnetism that extended far beyond the narrow demographic typically interested in 13-year-old basketball. The Blue Chips went undefeated in 2018 and won the NY2LA Swish N-Dish Tournament's Under-13 title in Wisconsin. Video footage from those tournaments circulated widely across basketball media. Williams and Bronny were often featured in the same clips, the same thumbnails, the same editorial packages. And over time, Williams developed an independent audience that tracked his career specifically, not just as adjacent to Bronny's, but as its own narrative thread. This is a crucial piece of the architecture. Williams's initial explosion in social media visibility was not purely organic. It was catalyzed by the gravitational field of the James family. Playing alongside Bronny meant playing in front of LeBron, which meant playing in front of the cameras that followed LeBron everywhere, which meant appearing in content that had a built-in distribution network of hundreds of millions of eyeballs. Williams was talented enough to capitalize on this exposure, but the exposure itself was a function of proximity to the most famous athlete on the planet. And this is not a diminishment of Williams. It is an observation about how visibility operates in networked media environments. Visibility compounds. Visibility attracts visibility. Being seen by many people causes you to be seen by more people because the algorithmic infrastructure of modern social media platforms preferentially surfaces content that has already generated engagement. The rich get richer. The visible become more visible. And the people who enter the attention economy through the door of proximity to existing visibility have a structural advantage over those who must generate their visibility purely on the merits of their performance. This is not an indictment of Williams or Bronny or LeBron. It is the architecture of the attention economy, which is indifferent to merit and responsive only to the prior conditions of distribution. And this matters because it reveals a pattern that will repeat throughout this essay. The pattern is this: visibility in modern sports is not primarily a function of ability. It is a function of contextual positioning. Williams was a very good basketball player who became enormously famous because he was positioned in the right context at the right time. And once you have that fame, that visibility, that platform, you can deploy it strategically, which is exactly what the HBCU tweet was, a strategic deployment, a test firing of the platform to see what the platform could do when aimed at a specific target using a specific message in a specific cultural moment. And the results of that test firing were extraordinary because they demonstrated that the platform had capabilities that even its operator may not have fully understood before he pulled the trigger. When Williams tweeted about going to an HBCU in June 2020, the timing was surgically precise. This was less than 2 weeks after the George Floyd murder. The Black Lives Matter protests were at their absolute peak. Police vehicles were being set on fire in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis 3rd Precinct had been burned to the ground. A Wendy's in Atlanta had been torched after the killing of Rayshard Brooks. Corporate America was in a full-scale panic about racial optics. Netflix had released a Black Lives Matter film collection. Spotify had added an 8-minute and 46-second silent track to playlists in memory of Floyd. NASCAR had banned the Confederate flag from its races. The NFL had announced the league's intention to play Lift Every Voice and Sing, historically known as the Black National Anthem, before every Week 1 game. The cultural conversation about Black institutional self-determination was at its most intense and most emotionally charged in at least 50 years, possibly in the entire post-civil rights era history of the country. And into that conversation, a 15-year-old with millions of followers dropped the suggestion that he, an elite basketball prospect who could go anywhere, might choose a historically Black institution. The response was seismic. Within days, HBCUs, that had never before been in the conversation for a player of Williams's profile, began offering him scholarships. Norfolk State, Tennessee State, Grambling State, Howard, Morehouse, Florida, A&M, North Carolina Central, Hampton, Alabama State, Texas, Southern. The story dominated sports media. Yahoo Sports published a long-form feature. Sports Illustrated followed with its own investigation of the phenomenon. ESPN devoted segments across multiple shows. The New York Times covered the potential implications for HBCU athletics. The Washington Post wrote about the broader context of Black student athletes reconsidering their relationship with predominantly white institutions. Think pieces proliferated. Podcasts debated the strategic logic. Marketing experts were quoted saying that the novelty of a marquee player making such an unprecedented decision would generate more brand value than going to a traditional powerhouse. As Bob Dorfman, executive director of Baker Street Advertising, put it, an elite athlete blazing a path to an HBCU would be a unique move, garnering significant attention, making him a standout, and building a huge following. The narrative energy was enormous. The cultural machinery of American sports media swung into full production mode, generating millions of words of content, thousands of hours of broadcast time, and a sustained conversation about the future of black talent in American college athletics that extended for weeks and resurfaced at every subsequent moment when racial consciousness entered the sports news cycle. But here's what actually happened. Mikey Williams never went to an HBCU, not even close. On November 5th, 2022, more than 2 years after the tweet that launched 1,000 think pieces, Williams committed to the University of Memphis. Memphis, a predominantly white institution in the American Athletic Conference, not even a top-tier program. Just a regular, formerly glorious but currently middling university with a coach, Penny Hardaway, who happened to have a relationship with the AAU circuit that Williams was embedded in. Hardaway, it should be noted, was himself a former NBA star with his own significant social media presence and celebrity infrastructure. The choice of Memphis over the HBCU options was, in the language of brand strategy, a choice of one celebrity-powered platform over another celebrity-powered platform. What it was not was a choice of black institutional development. It was not a choice of redirecting the gravitational pull of elite black talent toward historically underinvested institutions. It was a choice that, in its strategic logic, was almost perfectly aligned with the same predominantly white institution extraction model that the HBCU tweet had appeared to critique. And the thing that nobody talked about, the thing that got buried under the next news cycle, was the sheer gap between the narrative energy that the HBCU tweet generated and the structural outcome it produced. The tweet generated millions of impressions. It spawned articles in Yahoo Sports, Sports Illustrated, ESPN, and dozens of other outlets. It became part of the broader cultural conversation about HBC us and black self-determination. It contributed to a measurable increase in HBCU enrollment interest and application rates, and it produced exactly 0 elite basketball prospects at HBC us. 0. The net structural impact on HBCU basketball was nothing. Not a single high major prospect redirected his career. Not a single program received a transformative recruit. Not a single institutional investment flowed from the attention that the narrative generated. The narrative, in terms of material outputs for the institutions it claimed to support, was a zero-sum transaction. Energy went in, no energy came out. The institutions that had been positioned as the beneficiaries of the narrative were, in fact, not beneficiaries at all. They were props. They were the backdrop against which the narrative was performed. And once the performance ended, the backdrop remained exactly where it had always been, unimproved and unchanged. But the net impact on Mikey Williams' personal brand was enormous. The tweet positioned him not just as a basketball player, but as a cultural figure, a thought leader, a symbol of a generation that was willing to think differently about the relationship between black talent and white institutions. That positioning, that brand equity, was convertible into real economic value. Williams signed a multi-year endorsement deal with Puma in October 2021, becoming the first American high school basketball player to sign a sneaker deal with a global footwear company. He was 17 years old. The Puma deal was reportedly worth hundreds of thousands to potentially over $1 million annually, a figure that was unprecedented for a high school athlete in any sport. And the pathway to that deal, the reason Puma was willing to invest that level of capital in a high school player, was the brand positioning that the HBCU narrative had enabled. Williams was not just a basketball prospect. He was a cultural property, a point of view, a values alignment. And global brands, in the post-George Floyd environment, were desperately seeking cultural properties they could attach themselves to in order to signal alignment with the racial justice moment without requiring them to engage in any structural changes to their own operations. Williams, through the tweet, had made himself available as that kind of property, and the market responded accordingly. Now let's connect this to Deion Sanders, because the Mikey Williams episode was a proof of concept for exactly what Sanders would execute on a much larger scale 1 year later. The playbook was identical. Step 1, identify a moment of intense racial consciousness where the collective black imagination is hungry for symbols of self-determination. Step 2, position yourself or your brand as the embodiment of that self-determination. Step 3, harvest the attention, the media coverage, the emotional investment, and the brand equity that this positioning generates. Step 4, and this is the step that makes the strategy morally complicated, make a decision that maximizes your personal outcome regardless of whether it serves the institutional narrative you helped create. Williams tweeted about HBC us and went to Memphis. Sanders went to Jackson State and then went to Colorado. The pattern is identical. The scale is different. The emotional stakes are different. But the structural logic is the same. The HBCU narrative was not a destination. It was a vehicle. And the people who drove it the hardest were the people who were most willing to exit the vehicle when a better ride came along. There is one more data point in the Williams case that deserves attention because it illustrates the terminal ugliness of what happens when narrative value is extracted without being converted into structural value. Williams' collegiate basketball career has been, by any measurable standard, a disappointment. He committed to Memphis, but never played a game for the Tigers due to a criminal case involving gun charges. He entered the transfer portal before playing a single minute of college basketball. He transferred to UCF for the 2024-2025 season, where his production was modest. He then transferred again to Sacramento State, where Shaquille O'Neal's son, Shakir, would be his teammate. 4 schools in 4 years, no significant on-court production, and an NBA projection that has quietly evaporated as the realities of his development have diverged from the trajectory that the early narrative implied. The 17-year-old who had been positioned as the future of black athletic self-determination became, by 21, a journeyman whose most prominent cultural moment remained an 8-word tweet that had never translated into any subsequent action. The brand equity that the HBCU narrative had generated proved insufficient to sustain a basketball career when the basketball itself did not continue to develop at pace with the audience's expectations, which suggests something even more unsettling than the primary argument. It suggests that the narrative value of the HBCU positioning, while enormous in the moment, was structurally disconnected from any actual basketball development trajectory. The narrative was pure, the basketball was secondary. And when the basketball failed to hold up its end of the bargain, the narrative evaporated without leaving any residue behind. And this brings us to a deeper, more uncomfortable observation. The reason this strategy works, the reason it works every single time, is not because the people deploying it are unusually clever. It's because the audience, the Black American public, is unusually hungry. Hungry for symbols of progress. Hungry for narratives of self-determination. Hungry for evidence that the extractive relationship between black talent and white institutions is changing. And that hunger, that profound and legitimate desire for structural change, makes people vulnerable to spectacle. It makes them willing to project onto a tweet or a coaching hire or a recruiting commitment a significance that the actual event cannot bear. This is not a criticism of black people or black culture. This is a structural observation about how power operates in a media-saturated society. The people who control the spectacle, the people who can manufacture the right images at the right time, extract value from the emotional labor of their audience. The audience does the work of constructing the narrative. The audience does the work of investing the event with meaning. The audience does the work of defending the narrative against criticism. And the person at the center of the spectacle harvests the brand equity that all of that emotional labor produces. Mikey Williams understood this at 15. Deion Sanders understood this at 53. And the institution that was supposed to benefit from all of this energy, the HBCU, ended up exactly where it started, with passionate alumni, underfunded facilities, and the fading afterimage of a moment that was never designed to become a movement. The energy that the black audience had invested in projecting significance onto these moments could, in a different structural configuration, have been redirected toward actions that produced durable change. Financial contributions to HBCU endowments, lobbying for increased state funding for HBCU athletic programs, investment in the media infrastructure that would allow HBCU programs to develop their own broadcasting revenue streams, consumer boycotts of brands that extracted value from black culture without reinvesting in black institutions. All of these actions would have produced measurable structural outcomes, but all of them would have required sustained effort across long time horizons, with no immediate emotional payoff and no compelling individual protagonist around which to organize a narrative. The attention economy cannot support that kind of work. The attention economy requires spectacle, which requires individual protagonists, which requires compressed timelines, which requires emotional peaks and resolutions. Structural change is not spectacular. Structural change is boring. Structural change cannot compete with a 15-year-old's tweet for the limited bandwidth of the collective attention span. And so the spectacle wins, the structural change does not occur, and the audience is left with the same gap between aspiration and material reality that the spectacle had briefly appeared to be closing. But the Mikey Williams precedent is important for another reason, a reason that connects directly to the Travis Hunter analysis that occupies the center of this essay. Because Williams's brief flirtation with HBCUs demonstrated something crucial about the mechanics of attention in modern sports. It demonstrated that in an era of social media amplification, a single decision by a single athlete can generate more media coverage and cultural conversation than decades of institutional investment. One tweet from a 15-year-old generated more attention for HBCUs than years of lobbying, scholarship campaigns, and alumni fundraising combined. And this realization, this understanding that individual spectacle outperforms institutional effort in the attention economy, is exactly what Deion Sanders would operationalize when he recruited Travis Hunter. He understood that one recruit, the right recruit, positioned the right way at the right time, could generate more value than a decade of patient program building. And he was right. The Hunter commitment was, in the words of the Director of National Recruiting for 247 Sports, the biggest signing day moment in the history of college football. But as we'll explore in the next section, the biggest moment is not the same thing as the most meaningful moment, and the gap between bigness and meaning is where the real story lives. The Mikey Williams precedent had already established that the gap could be exploited. Sanders' contribution was to exploit it at a scale that no previous operator had attempted and that no subsequent operator has yet matched. He took the Williams playbook and ran it not for a sneaker deal, but for a coaching career. Not for a high school athlete's endorsement portfolio, but for a 53-year-old Hall of Famer's second act. The scale was different, the stakes were different, the extraction was different, but the underlying mechanics were identical. Identify the moment, position the brand, harvest the attention, exit at maximum value, and leave the audience to reconcile what they thought they had witnessed with what had actually been done to them. This is the Mikey Williams precedent, and everything that followed, from Hunter's Jackson State commitment to Sanders' Colorado departure to the current state of HBCU football in 2026, was prefigured in those 8 words that a 15-year-old posted on a Tuesday in June 2020 during a summer when America briefly believed it was about to change and then, predictably, didn't. This is the section where we dismantle the central mythology of the Travis Hunter phenomenon, and I need you to understand something before we begin. What I'm about to argue is not that Travis Hunter is a bad football player. He's not. He's a very good football player. He was a very productive college player who won the Heisman Trophy and was drafted 2nd overall in the 2025 NFL Draft by the Jacksonville Jaguars. What I'm about to argue is something much more specific and much more unsettling. I'm going to argue that the thing Travis Hunter is most famous for, the thing that made him a cultural phenomenon, the thing that won him the Heisman and made him the face of a generation of college football, was not primarily a function of his athletic ability. It was a function of his coach's willingness to let him do it. And that distinction, the distinction between ability and access, between talent and permission, is one of the most important and least understood dynamics in all of American football, not just in this case, in every era, in every position. The gap between what athletes can do and what athletes are allowed to do is the gap where careers are made and destroyed, where transcendence is manufactured and suppressed, where the difference between a first-round pick and an undrafted free agent often comes down to one coach's one decision at one moment in one player's development. Let's start with the basic claim. Travis Hunter played both sides of the ball. He played cornerback on defense and wide receiver on offense. And this was presented by the media, by fans, by the college football establishment, and eventually by Heisman voters as evidence of transcendent, generational, once-in-a-lifetime athletic ability. The logic was simple and seductive. Playing one position in major college football is incredibly difficult. The physical demands, the mental demands, the preparation demands are overwhelming. Playing 2 positions on both sides of the ball is therefore twice as difficult. And anyone who can do it at an elite level must be, by definition, a transcendent athlete, a freak of nature, a once-in-a-generation talent. This logic is intuitive, it's emotionally compelling, and it is fundamentally, structurally wrong, because it treats positional deployment as if it were a function of the athlete's capabilities, when in fact positional deployment is almost entirely a function of the coaching staff's decisions. The athlete does not choose whether to play both ways. The coach chooses. And the coach's choice is constrained not primarily by the athlete's ability, but by a host of institutional, strategic, and professional considerations that have little to do with what the athlete could theoretically do if given the opportunity. Playing both sides of the ball in college football is not a test of athletic ability. It is a test of coaching permission. The limiting factor on whether a player plays both ways is not whether he can do it. The limiting factor is whether his coach will let him do it. And this distinction is not trivial. It is the entire ballgame. It is the thing that separates the Travis Hunter narrative from reality. Think about it this way. At every major college football program in America, there are players on the roster who have the physical tools to contribute on both sides of the ball. Wide receivers who were defensive backs in high school, linebackers who were running backs, safeties who were quarterbacks. The talent pipeline in college football is filled with multi-positional athletes who were stars on both sides of the ball at the high school level. Most 5-star recruits played multiple positions in high school. Most 4-star recruits played multiple positions in high school. The ability to play multiple positions is, at the high school level, the baseline expectation, rather than the exceptional case. The reason these players don't play both ways in college is not that they can't. It's that they're not allowed to. And the reason they're not allowed to is because of the incentive structure that coaches operate within. A college football coach's job security depends on wins. Wins depend on depth. Depth depends on specialization. If you take your best cornerback and also make him your starting wide receiver, you now have a problem. You have one player occupying 2 roster spots. If that player gets injured on offense, you've lost your best defensive player. If he gets fatigued in the 4th quarter because he's been playing double the snaps, his performance on both sides degrades. and you've denied developmental reps to the backup cornerback and the backup receiver who now haven't gotten the game experience they need to contribute if the starter goes down. This is not a theoretical concern. This is the practical reality that every defensive coordinator and offensive coordinator in college football thinks about every single day. The depth chart is the primary preoccupation of the modern coaching staff because injuries are inevitable, fatigue is inevitable, and the programs that win at the highest level are the programs that can absorb the loss of any individual player without catastrophic degradation in performance. Two-way play is the single decision that most directly undermines this depth philosophy. It concentrates risk. It bottlenecks talent. It creates single points of failure in what should be a redundant system. This is why two-way players essentially disappeared from major college football decades ago. Not because athletes got less talented. Athletes are measurably bigger, faster, and stronger than they were in previous eras. The combine numbers from the 2025 NFL class are, on average, significantly better than the combine numbers from the 1985 NFL class across every measurable category. Players are more athletic. Players are better trained. Players have better nutrition. Players have access to sports science that the athletes of previous generations could not have imagined. If two-way play were primarily a function of athletic ability, we would expect to see more two-way players today than in previous eras, not fewer. But we see fewer, dramatically fewer. Two-way play disappeared because the coaching profession developed a collective understanding that specialization optimizes outcomes. And any coach who deviates from that consensus is taking a strategic risk that could cost him his job. The coaching profession has become, over the last several decades, a conformity machine. Innovation occurs at the margins. The core strategic principles are enforced through a feedback loop where coaches who deviate and fail are removed from the profession, while coaches who conform and fail are often retained because their failures cannot be attributed to unconventional decision-making. The asymmetric penalty structure favors conservatism. Conservatism favors specialization. Specialization eliminates two-way play. And two-way play, when it reappears, becomes so rare that its novelty is the story, not the athletic achievement it appears to represent. So when Deion Sanders put Travis Hunter on both sides of the ball, he was not revealing Hunter's transcendent ability. He was exercising a coaching prerogative that almost no other coach in America would exercise. And he had specific reasons, strategic reasons, selfish reasons, and contextually rational reasons for doing so. The strategic reason was this. At Jackson State, and later at Colorado, Sanders did not have the depth of talent that an Alabama or an Ohio State or a Georgia has. He couldn't afford to waste his best athlete on only half the snaps. By playing Hunter both ways, he was maximizing the total contribution of his most talented player in an environment where the talent gap between his team and its opponents was significant. At Jackson State, this calculation was especially favorable because the opposition was so dramatically inferior that Hunter could absorb the additional snap load without facing the caliber of competition that would make the durability risk catastrophic. At Colorado, the calculation was more complicated because the Big 12 competition was meaningfully better than SWAC competition, but Sanders continued the two-way deployment because the spectacle had become the product. Stopping the two-way deployment at Colorado would have been admitting that the previous deployment had been partially cosmetic. And Sanders, whose entire strategic position depended on the credibility of the two-way narrative, could not afford that admission. The selfish reason was this. Playing Hunter both ways created a spectacle. It generated media attention. It differentiated the Sanders program from every other program in the country. It gave sports media a narrative hook that was irresistible. And that media attention translated directly into recruiting advantages, brand value, and the kind of cultural capital that made Sanders a viable candidate for bigger jobs. The two-way deployment was, in effect, a permanent advertising campaign for the Sanders coaching brand. Every time Hunter touched the ball on either side, every time a cornerback made a play and then lined up as a receiver on the next drive, every time a receiver caught a touchdown and then returned to the defensive huddle, the Sanders program was generating the kind of content that social media algorithms preferentially surface and that traditional media cannot ignore. The content was the product. Hunter was the talent being deployed to produce the content. And Sanders was the executive producer whose program was generating the content for consumption by audiences whose attention he could convert into tangible career outcomes. Viewed through this lens, the two-way deployment was not primarily about winning football games. It was about producing content. The football games were the vehicle. The content was the destination. And here's the contextually rational reason, the one that requires the deepest understanding of football's structural dynamics. At Jackson State, Hunter was playing against FCS competition. The Southwestern Athletic Conference, where Jackson State competed, is one of the weakest conferences in college football. The average talent level of the opponents Hunter faced was dramatically lower than what he would face in the SEC or the Big Ten. This matters enormously because it means the physical demands of playing both ways were substantially lower than they would be at a Power 5 program. The cornerback reps were against receivers who were slower, less polished, and less physically imposing. The receiver reps were against defensive backs who were less athletic and less technically sound. Playing both ways against SWAC competition is a fundamentally different physical challenge than playing both ways against SEC competition. The collisions are less severe, the matchups are less demanding, the accumulation of wear and tear across an entire season is structurally less punishing. But the narrative doesn't acknowledge this. The narrative treats all snaps as equal because the narrative is designed to generate awe, not accuracy. Every snap count, whether against Alabama State or against Alabama, is added to the same total, and the total becomes the story. The fact that the snaps were not equivalent in their physical demands is invisible to the audience and irrelevant to the narrative. When Hunter transferred to Colorado and began playing Big 12 competition, the physical demands increased meaningfully. And it is notable, in retrospect, that Hunter's single most productive college season in terms of individual statistics and awards occurred at Colorado, not Jackson State. At Colorado, against Big 12 competition, Hunter posted 1,258 receiving yards and 15 touchdowns on offense, 35 tackles, 4 interceptions, and 11 passes defended on defense, and won the Heisman Trophy. But Colorado also went 9-4. They lost to Nebraska, Kansas State, Kansas, and BYU, which means that even with a Heisman Trophy winner playing both ways, the program could not translate individual excellence into consistent team success, which suggests that the two-way deployment, while effective as a content strategy, was less effective as a team strategy. If Hunter had played only one position, the program might have been more successful overall because the coaching staff would have had more snaps available for other players to develop, more redundancy in the event of injury, and more strategic flexibility in game planning. The two-way deployment optimized for Hunter's individual narrative at the expense of the team's competitive ceiling. This is the kind of trade-off that most coaches would never make. Most coaches would prioritize team success over individual narrative because most coaches are evaluated primarily on wins and losses rather than on media attention. Sanders was in the unusual position of being evaluated primarily on media attention because his celebrity status made him functionally immune to the normal coaching accountability mechanisms. He could accept the team-level trade-off because his personal brand did not depend on team success. It depended on spectacle, and spectacle was what the two-way deployment produced. Now let me take this deeper. Let me show you why the two-way player narrative is not just misleading, but is actually a window into one of the most important and least discussed dynamics in all of football. The dynamic of coaching as gatekeeping. A college football coach has almost absolute control over whether a player succeeds or fails. Not absolute control over the outcome of individual plays, of course, but absolute control over the conditions under which those plays occur. The coach decides what formation to run. The coach decides what play to call. The coach decides which players are on the field for which downs and situations. The coach decides the practice structure, the film study schedule, the strength and conditioning program, and the game plan that determines how each player's abilities will be deployed. The coach decides who starts and who sits. The coach decides who gets the featured touches and who gets the complimentary role. The coach decides which players are highlighted in media interactions and which ones are kept away from cameras. And the coach decides, perhaps most consequentially, which players are developed over time and which ones are allowed to stagnate. A player who is not given developmental attention will not develop. A player who is not given opportunities will not accumulate the tape that convinces NFL scouts of his professional viability. A player who is not given media exposure will not build the personal brand that, in the NIL era, determines his economic value at every subsequent stage of his career. And here's the part that most people never consider. The coach also controls the context in which a player's statistics are generated. And statistics, in football, are not objective measures of individual ability. Statistics are artifacts of systemic conditions. They are the residue of play design, opponent quality, teammate competence, and situational deployment. Let me give you an example that makes this concrete. Imagine a linebacker in a defensive system where the defensive line is composed of undersized, athletically limited players who get pushed around at the point of attack. In this system, offensive linemen will frequently get to the second level. Running backs will reach the linebacker level before being contacted. And the linebacker, because he's seeing more runners in his area, will accumulate a disproportionate number of tackles. He might lead the conference in tackles. He might be named first team all-conference. He might be projected as a mid-round NFL draft pick. And all of those outcomes would be, in significant part, a function of the system he played in, rather than some transcendent individual ability. Now imagine that same linebacker playing behind a defensive line that includes a dominant nose tackle who commands double teams and a first-round edge rusher like Myles Garrett or Nick Bosa who disrupts plays in the backfield. In this front, the offensive line is occupied at the first level. Running backs are being tackled behind the line of scrimmage, or at the line of scrimmage. Fewer plays develop to the second level, and the linebacker's tackle total drops dramatically. Not because he's worse, Because the context changed. The same player with the same physical tools and the same football IQ produces significantly fewer tackles. His statistics regress to competence. His draft projection declines. His career trajectory shifts. And the reason is entirely upstream of his individual contribution. The reason is the defensive line in front of him, or rather, the coach's decisions about how to construct that defensive line. This is not a hypothetical. This is how football actually works. And it's the lens through which Travis Hunter's production, on both sides of the ball, needs to be evaluated. Hunter was productive at Jackson State because he was the best athlete on a team playing against vastly inferior competition in a system specifically designed to maximize his involvement. He was productive at Colorado because Sanders continued to design the offense and defense around maximizing Hunter's snap count and touch count, even when it meant subordinating broader team strategy to the spectacle of the two-way player narrative. At every point in Hunter's college career, the conditions under which his statistics were generated were deliberately, strategically engineered to maximize those statistics. He was not accumulating production in a neutral environment. He was accumulating production in an environment specifically designed to inflate his production. The production was real in the sense that the ball was actually caught and the tackles were actually made. The production was manufactured in the sense that the conditions enabling the production were artificial, in the sense that no other coach in the country would have constructed those conditions, and in the sense that those conditions cannot be replicated at the NFL level, where coaches are evaluated more on team outcomes and less on individual spectacle. And here's the measurables argument, the part that most people refuse to engage with because the emotional narrative is too powerful. At the NFL Combine in February 2025, Travis Hunter measured at 6 feet and 3/8 of an inch tall, which the official NFL measurement of 6'003" means 6 feet, 0 inches, 3/8. His weight was 188 pounds. His arm length was 31 3/8 inches. His hand size was 9 1/8 inches. He did not run the 40-yard dash at the Combine. He did not run it at Colorado's Pro Day. To this day, there is no official timed 40 for Travis Hunter. Think about that for a moment. The most hyped two-way player in modern college football history, a player whose entire brand is built on the idea that he possesses generational athleticism, chose not to run the single most important test of straight-line speed in the pre-draft evaluation process. And nobody asked why, or rather, people asked, but the asking was quickly absorbed into a narrative of confidence, of a player so good he didn't need to prove anything, of a generational talent whose film spoke for itself. This framing is nonsense. The film never speaks for itself. The film is always interpreted through the lens of measurable physical attributes. A 40-yard dash time is not an accessory to the film evaluation. It is the baseline data point against which the film is calibrated. A receiver who runs a 4.35 and catches a 50-yard touchdown is a different player than a receiver who runs a 4.55 and catches the same 50-yard touchdown. The time matters. The absence of the time creates evaluation uncertainty. And evaluation uncertainty, in a draft context, should lower a player's draft stock, not raise it. At 6 feet, 188 pounds, Hunter's size profile places him in the 20th percentile for weight among NFL receivers and the 30th percentile among cornerbacks. His arm length of 31 3/8 inches is in the 33rd percentile for receivers and the 48th percentile for corners. These are not transcendent measurables. These are not even above average measurables. These are the measurables of a competent, athletic, but physically unremarkable prospect who would, without the two-way narrative and the Heisman Trophy and the media apparatus that Deion Sanders built around him, be viewed as exactly what his body says he is: a good player, a versatile player, a first-round talent probably, but not the second overall pick, not a generational prospect, not the mythological figure that the spectacle machine manufactured. The best pro comparison for Hunter's measurable profile as a wide receiver is Devonta Smith, who was 6 feet, 170 pounds at the Combine. Smith has had a productive NFL career. He's not a transcendent player. He's not a top 5 receiver in the league. He's a good player who succeeds because of route running technique and hands, rather than because of athletic superiority. Hunter's measurable profile suggests he should project to a similar career ceiling, with the complication that he will also be expected to contribute on defense, which will subtract from his developmental time on offense and reduce his upside as a receiver below what Smith was able to achieve. And this is where the comparison gets really uncomfortable. Because if you strip away the narrative, if you strip away the spectacle, if you strip away the two-way gimmick in the HBCU storyline and the Sanders celebrity machine, and you just look at what Travis Hunter is in football terms, you see a 6 foot, 188 corner receiver tweener with good ball skills, solid technique, adequate athleticism, and no elite measurable in any single physical category. You see a player who profiles as a high-floor, moderate-ceiling NFL contributor. You see a player who, in his first NFL season with the Jacksonville Jaguars, played 7 games before being placed on injured reserve, recording 28 receptions for 298 yards. 7 games, 28 receptions, injured reserve. That's not transcendence. That's competence meeting the reality that the NFL doesn't care about your narrative. The NFL cares about your measurables, your durability, and your ability to win one-on-one matchups against other elite athletes. And without Deion Sanders controlling the context, without the HBCU spotlight, without the permission to play both ways against inferior competition, Hunter is being revealed as what the data always suggested he was. Very good. Not transcendent. A first-round talent, but not a franchise-altering one. A player who, in the fullness of an NFL career, will likely have several strong seasons and will probably make at least one Pro Bowl, but who will not define a generation, will not alter the paradigms of his position, and will not retrospectively justify the second overall pick investment that the Jaguars made to acquire him. The two-way narrative was the most successful confidence operation in the history of college football. And the confidence was not placed in Travis Hunter. The confidence was placed in Deion Sanders' ability to make Travis Hunter look like something he isn't. Sanders delivered on that confidence for the duration of Hunter's college career. He made Hunter look like a generational talent. He manufactured the conditions under which Hunter's actual abilities, amplified by the right system and the right competition and the right narrative framing, produced statistics and accolades that matched the generational talent story. But the delivery required the conditions, and the conditions required Sanders. When Sanders was no longer the architect of Hunter's context, the illusion began to decay. The first NFL season is the first data point in what will be a multi-year process of recalibration, during which the market will gradually understand that what it thought it was buying was not what it actually bought. And the recalibration will be painful. For Hunter, because the expectations on him are impossible to meet. For the Jaguars, because they paid franchise-altering prices for a very good player. And for the broader college football ecosystem, because the lesson of the Hunter case is a lesson that the ecosystem cannot easily absorb without questioning the foundational assumptions that its entire evaluation apparatus is built on. Now let's talk about Derrick Henry, because Derrick Henry is the single best illustration of the principle that football is a game of context. And that context, not raw physical ability, is what separates the transcendent from the merely competent. And once you understand the Henry principle, you can never look at football the same way again. You can't watch a highlight reel without asking what the context was that produced the highlight. You can't evaluate a draft prospect without asking what positional frame his measurables are being evaluated within. You can't celebrate an athletic feat without asking whether the same feat, performed by the same body at a different position, would have been considered a feat at all. The Henry principle is disorienting because it reveals that the categories we use to organize football talent are not natural categories. They are constructed categories, and the construction is performed by coaches, scouts, and media apparatuses whose incentives are not necessarily aligned with accurate evaluation. Here are Derrick Henry's measurables from the 2016 NFL Combine, conducted in February of that year at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis, immediately following his Heisman Trophy-winning senior season at Alabama. Height, 6 feet 3 inches. Weight, 247 pounds. 40-yard dash, 4.54 seconds. Vertical jump, 37 inches. Broad jump, 130 inches. 20-yard shuttle, 4.38 seconds. 3-cone drill, 7.20 seconds. Arm length, 33 inches. Hand size, 8.75 inches. Bench press, 22 repetitions of 225 pounds. These are the baseline measurements that would be used to evaluate Henry against the historical database of NFL running backs and to project his professional potential. Let us now do something that almost nobody in football media ever does. Let us actually analyze these numbers in context, rather than just marveling at them. 6'3", 247. That's big for a running back. In fact, it's massive for a running back. Henry's size profile is in the 98th percentile for NFL running backs in terms of speed score, which is a metric that accounts for both weight and 40 time. This is where the mythology starts. Announcers love to talk about Henry's size. The visual of a 6'3", 250 running back, steamrolling defensive backs and linebackers, is viscerally compelling. It looks transcendent. It looks like something that shouldn't be possible. A man that big, moving that fast. Ed Reed, the Hall of Fame safety, once said that Henry looked like a thoroughbred horse. Other analysts have compared him to a mythological creature, a locomotive, a force of nature. The language used to describe Henry's physical profile now is consistently superlative, consistently elevated, consistently reaching for metaphors that place him outside the normal human distribution. And the metaphors are not wrong, exactly. Henry is genuinely unusual for a running back. The question is what we mean by unusual, and what the unusual becomes when we change the positional frame through which it is viewed. But here's the thing. 6'3", 247 is not unusual in football. It's not even unusual at a single position. It's just unusual at running back. If Derrick Henry were an inside linebacker instead of a running back, his size profile would be almost exactly average. The average NFL inside linebacker is about 6'1" to 6'2", 235 to 250 pounds. Henry's height is slightly above average for a linebacker. His weight is right in the middle of the range. His 40 time of 4.54 would be adequate but unremarkable for a linebacker. His vertical jump of 37 inches would be solid but not elite. His agility numbers, the shuttle and 3-cone, would be below average for linebackers who are expected to change direction quickly in coverage. His arm length and hand size would be typical. His bench press would be on the lower end. In summary, the same body, the same person, the same measurements, evaluated as an inside linebacker rather than as a running back, would be considered a mid-round NFL prospect, possibly a day 3 selection, with average physical tools and a career projection of rotational contributor rather than franchise cornerstone. Do you see what just happened? The same human being, the same body, the same measurables, the same athletic profile, shifts from transcendent to ordinary simply by changing the positional label. As a running back, Derrick Henry is a physical anomaly. As a linebacker, Derrick Henry is a guy, a competent, adequately athletic, properly sized guy who would probably go in the 3rd or 4th round of the draft and have a solid but unremarkable career. His Hall of Fame trajectory, his record-setting 2,227 rushing yard season in 2020, his 99-yard touchdown run against the Jaguars in 2018, his multiple Offensive Player of the Year candidacies, his franchise-defining tenure with the Tennessee Titans, his subsequent high-value free agency with the Baltimore Ravens, his 5-year, $90 million career earnings profile, all of it would not have happened. Instead, there would have been a linebacker named Derrick Henry, who played 7 years in the NFL, accumulated modest statistics, and retired to a quiet life of post-career anonymity. Same body, same person, same abilities, different career, different legacy, different economic output, different cultural significance, all because someone, at some point in his football development, decided that the positional frame through which his body should be evaluated was running back rather than linebacker. This is what I mean when I say football is a context machine. The position a player is assigned to determines the lens through which his physical attributes are interpreted, and that lens doesn't just affect perception, it affects everything. It affects draft position, which affects contract value, which affects playing time, which affects statistical production, which affects Pro Bowl selections and All-Pro nominations, which affects Hall of Fame candidacy, which affects historical legacy. The entire trajectory of a career, the entire economic and cultural output of a human being's professional life can be determined by the contextual frame that is applied to his body. And the contextual frame is not applied by the athlete. The contextual frame is applied by coaches, first in youth football, then in high school, then in college, and finally at the professional level. Each stage narrows the possibilities. Each decision at each stage forecloses alternative career paths. By the time a player reaches the NFL, the positional frame has been in place for so long and has been validated by so many statistical outputs at the college level that reversing it becomes essentially impossible. The frame becomes reality, the reality becomes destiny, and the destiny is indistinguishable from the frame that produced it. Henry's specific case illustrates how early these decisions get made and how consequential they are. Henry played running back at Yulee High School in Florida, where he set the national high school rushing record with 12,124 career rushing yards. He was, even in high school, identified as a running back because he had been identified as a running back in middle school, which had happened because he had been identified as a running back in Pop Warner, which had happened because at each stage, someone made the decision that his body and his skill set suited running back rather than any other position. If, at any stage, a coach had decided that Henry's body and skill set suited inside linebacker or defensive end or fullback, his entire career would have branched onto a different trajectory. And the decision at each stage was not made based on some objective evaluation of Henry's maximum potential across all possible positions. The decision was made based on the tactical needs of the specific team at the specific stage of his development. At Yulee High School, the coaches needed a running back who could carry the offense. Henry fit that need. He was deployed accordingly. And the deployment pattern, once established, was reinforced by the statistical outputs that the deployment produced. By the time Alabama recruited him, Henry was not a potential athlete with multi-positional flexibility. He was a running back. That positional identity had been constructed by thousands of snaps of high school tape, and the identity was now the thing being recruited, not the underlying body that had been arbitrarily assigned to that identity at some earlier stage. And this isn't just about Henry. This is about the entire sport. Think about the quarterbacks who were told they were too short. Drew Brees, at 6 feet, was told throughout his development that he was too short to play quarterback at the highest level. He was the second pick of the second round, not because his ability was in question, but because his height was. He went on to win a Super Bowl and became one of the most productive passers in NFL history. Russell Wilson, at 5 feet 11, had to convince the Seattle Seahawks to invest a third-round pick in him despite measurables that suggested he should be playing a different position. He won a Super Bowl too. Kyler Murray, at 5 feet 10, was told he should play baseball, where he had been drafted in the first round by the Oakland Athletics, rather than pursue football, where his height was considered disqualifying for quarterback. He won the Heisman Trophy and was the first overall pick in the 2019 NFL Draft. In each case, the player succeeded despite the positional template that wanted to exclude him. And in each case, the positional template itself expanded to accommodate the proof of concept that the player provided. The template expanded, but only after the individual player fought through it. And for every Breeze and Wilson and Murray who fought through the template, there were dozens of equally talented players who didn't, who were redirected to other positions early in their development, and whose quarterback potential was never realized because the gatekeeping decisions happened upstream of any opportunity to prove themselves. Think about the wide receivers who were told they were too slow. Anquan Boldin ran a 4.71 at the NFL Combine. He was considered too slow to play wide receiver at the highest level. He went on to have a 14-year NFL career, accumulate over 13,000 receiving yards, and win a Super Bowl. Keyshawn Johnson ran a 4.65 and had a similar career profile. In both cases, the timed speed that was supposed to disqualify them from the position turned out to be less important than the route running, hand-eye coordination, body control, and physicality that they brought to the position. The measurable that was supposed to define their ceiling was revealed to be an overweighted input in the evaluation framework. And yet the evaluation framework continues to overweight the 40-yard dash as a predictor of wide receiver success, because the framework is built on precedent, and precedent is slow to update even when the data contradicts it. Think about the defensive ends who were told they were too small. DeMarcus Ware was 6'4", 251 pounds. That's small for a traditional defensive end. He was considered a tweener coming out of college, not quite big enough for end, not quite rangy enough for outside linebacker in a 3-4. The Dallas Cowboys drafted him 11th overall and deployed him as an outside linebacker in a 3-4 scheme specifically designed to maximize his pass rush ability. He became one of the greatest pass rushers in NFL history, finishing his career with 138.5 sacks and a Hall of Fame induction. The deployment created the conditions for his success. A different scheme, a different coaching staff, a different set of decisions, and Ware might have had a competent but unremarkable career as a traditional defensive end who was slightly undersized for the role. The scheme was the destiny. Ware's ability was necessary but not sufficient. The scheme was the missing ingredient, and the scheme was provided by the coaching staff, not by Ware himself. In every case, what was really being said when players were told they were too short or too small or too slow was not that the player lacked ability. What was being said was that the player didn't fit the contextual template that coaches and scouts had constructed for what a player at that position was supposed to look like. The template was the problem, not the player. And the template is not a natural phenomenon. The template is a constructed artifact built over decades of precedent, reinforced by selection effects, where coaches who deviated from the template and failed were punished, while coaches who conformed to the template and failed were excused. The template, once established, becomes self-perpetuating. It defines what a player at a given position looks like, which determines which players get drafted at that position, which determines which players succeed at that position, which retroactively validates the template. It is a closed loop, and breaking the loop requires individual coaches to make unilateral decisions that contradict the template, based on their own evaluation of specific players whose profile suggests that the template is not adequate for their case. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the contextual template is not fixed. It evolves. It changes in response to proof of concept. When a player succeeds despite not fitting the template expands. When Michael Vick succeeded as a running quarterback, the template for NFL quarterbacks expanded to include dual threat mobility. When Taysom Hill showed that a quarterback could contribute as a runner, blocker, and receiver, the template expanded again. When Travis Kelce demonstrated that a tight end could be a team's primary receiving weapon, the template for tight ends shifted. When George Kittle added elite blocking to the receiving template, the expectation for tight ends expanded to include both functions at high levels. When Deebo Samuel was deployed as a receiver-running back hybrid in the San Francisco 49ers offense, the template for receivers expanded to include designed rushing attempts. Each expansion was driven by a specific player in a specific system under a specific coaching staff that made the unilateral decision to deviate from the template. And each expansion, once validated by statistical output, created new positional categories that subsequent players could aspire to occupy. But here's the critical insight. The template expansion doesn't happen because scouts and coaches voluntarily broaden their thinking. It happens because individual coaches make unilateral decisions to deploy players in non-standard ways. And those deployments produce results that force the rest of the league to reconsider its assumptions. The coach is the gatekeeper. The coach decides whether a player gets the opportunity to prove that the template is wrong. And most coaches, because their jobs depend on conformity to consensus, never make that decision. This is exactly what happened with Deion Sanders and Travis Hunter. Sanders made the unilateral decision to play Hunter both ways. This decision was not available to Hunter at any other program. If Hunter had gone to Alabama, Nick Saban would not have played him both ways. If he had gone to Georgia, Kirby Smart would not have played him both ways. If he had stayed at Florida State, Mike Norvell would not have played him both ways. not because Hunter lacked the ability, but because those coaches operated within the standard incentive structure that penalizes deviation from specialization. The template said that elite 5-star athletes with Hunter's profile specialize at one position and achieve excellence through focused development. Deviation from the template was professionally risky for any coach who made it. Sanders was uniquely positioned to absorb that risk. Sanders was uniquely positioned to deviate from this consensus for several reasons. First, he was coaching at an FCS school where the talent gap made two-way play less risky. Second, his celebrity status gave him a degree of job security that most coaches don't have. He couldn't be fired for being unconventional because he was the brand. The institution could not afford to fire him regardless of outcomes, because firing him would destroy more value than any plausible coaching failure could produce. Third, and most importantly, his strategic objective was not to win a national championship. His strategic objective was to generate spectacle, and spectacle requires novelty. A very good cornerback at an FCS school is not novel. A two-way player at an FCS school, the first 5-star recruit to ever sign with an HBCU, playing both offense and defense in a program coached by a Hall of Famer, is novel. It's irresistible to media, it's irresistible to fans, and it's the kind of narrative that wins Heisman trophies. The incentive alignment between Sanders' personal brand objectives and Hunter's two-way deployment was nearly perfect. The alignment was so tight, in fact, that it became difficult to tell whether the deployment was primarily about Hunter's development or about Sanders' brand. The answer, most likely, was both. But the primary beneficiary was Sanders, because the brand equity generated by the spectacle was portable and durable, while Hunter's individual production was transient and dependent on the specific conditions that Sanders had engineered. Because here's the dirty secret about the Heisman Trophy. The Heisman is not an award for the best football player in America. The Heisman is an award for the most compelling football narrative in America, the most compelling story, the most discussed player, the player who generated the most column inches and television segments and social media engagement. And by that standard, Travis Hunter was the obvious choice in 2024. Not because he was measurably better than every other player in college football, but because his story, the HBCU prodigy turned two-way phenomenon, was the most interesting story in the sport. There were quarterbacks who had produced more offensive value. There were running backs who had carried their teams more decisively. There were pass rushers whose individual dominance on defense arguably exceeded Hunter's contributions on either side of the ball. But none of them had the story that Hunter had. None of them had the gimmick. None of them had the narrative arc that stretched from the Jackson State flip to the Colorado transfer to the Heisman stage. The narrative arc was the Heisman campaign. The statistics were retrofitted into the narrative arc to justify the award that the narrative arc was pointing toward. Derrick Henry illustrates the same principle from a different angle. Henry's dominance is real. He has rushed for over 2,000 yards in an NFL season. He has a 99-yard touchdown run on his resume. He has been one of the most productive running backs of his era. But his dominance is not a function of transcendent physical ability in absolute terms. It's a function of transcendent physical ability relative to the positional context he occupies. Put him at linebacker, and he's average. Put him at running back, and he's a Hall of Famer. The body's the same. The context is everything. And the context was provided by the thousands of coaches, scouts, trainers, and teammates who, across more than a decade of Henry's athletic development, participated in the construction of the running back identity that his body was assigned to. Henry did not choose this identity in any meaningful sense. The identity was constructed around him by a succession of gatekeeping decisions that each narrowed the alternative paths his career could have taken. By the time he arrived at the NFL Combine in 2016, the identity was complete and irreversible. His subsequent career simply actualized the potential that the identity had preserved. And this is the principle that will guide the rest of this analysis. Because what Deion Sanders understood, what Bobby Petrino understood, what every great football coach and strategist understands, is that context doesn't just interpret ability. Context creates ability. The right system, the right formation, the right play call, the right situational deployment can make an above-average athlete look transcendent, and the wrong context can make a transcendent athlete look ordinary. Football is not a test of individual ability. Football is a test of how effectively individual ability is contextualized by systemic design. And the person who designs the system, the coach, is the most powerful figure in the entire apparatus. Not the player. The coach, not the owner. The coach, not the general manager whose decisions are executed within the constraints that the coach establishes. The coach is the context architect. The coach determines what the players on the field are capable of appearing to be. And everything else, every stat line, every highlight, every accolade, every career trajectory, is downstream of that architectural decision. The Derrick Henry case teaches us something that the Travis Hunter case will teach us from a different angle. It teaches us that the categories we use to evaluate football talent are not natural categories. They are constructed categories. Running back is not a natural kind. Cornerback is not a natural kind. Inside linebacker is not a natural kind. These are organizational artifacts developed over decades of football evolution that serve administrative and tactical purposes, but that have no grounding in any deep truth about the athletes who occupy them. And because the categories are constructed, they can be reconstructed. The boundaries can be redrawn, the criteria for inclusion can be modified, the evaluative frameworks can be revised. All of this happens slowly as new players enter the sport and old players retire. The categories are always in flux, but the flux is invisible to most participants in the sport because at any given moment the categories feel fixed and inevitable. The Derrick Henry case, properly understood, reveals the constructedness of the categories. Same body, 2 possible categories, 2 radically different career trajectories. The body didn't choose, the coaches chose, and the choice determined the destiny. This is the section where the argument crystallizes, because everything I've said so far about context, about spectacle, about the manufacture of transcendence, finds its most powerful evidence in a case study that almost nobody talks about. The case study is Louisville football under Bobby Petrino, and the 2 players at its center are Reggie Bonifon and Lamar Jackson. And once you understand what happened at Louisville between 2014 and 2016, you can never again look at the Heisman Trophy, the NFL draft, or the concept of a franchise quarterback without seeing the machinery behind the myth. You will understand, with a clarity that will be difficult to unsee, that the difference between one of the greatest college football seasons in history and a career that ended without an NFL snap at quarterback was a coaching decision made at a specific moment by a specific person whose name the vast majority of football fans have forgotten or never knew. That coach was Bobby Petrino. The decision was whether to start Lamar Jackson or continue with Reggie Bonifon as Louisville's starting quarterback in the fall of 2015. And the consequences of that decision echo through 2 decades of football history in ways that expose the fragility of the entire mythology of individual athletic transcendence that American sports culture is built on. Let's start with Reggie Bonifon. Bonifon was a 4-star dual-threat quarterback out of Trinity High School in Louisville, Kentucky. He was recruited by Bobby Petrino as the future of the Louisville program. He was rated the 22nd best quarterback in his class by Scout.com. He was 6'2", 180 pounds as a recruit, and he was, by every measure available, an exceptional athlete. He had a 43.5-inch standing vertical leap. Let me say that again with proper emphasis, because this number is one of the most important data points in this entire essay. Bonifon's standing vertical jump, measured without a running start, was 43.5 inches. To put that in context, the average NFL defensive back, the most athletic position group in professional football, has a vertical leap of about 35 to 36 inches. Elite NBA athletes with reputations as otherworldly jumpers often measure in the 40 to 44-inch range. Michael Jordan's reported vertical was 46 inches, though that figure has been disputed and likely includes a running approach. Bonifon's standing vertical was not just above average. It was in the upper echelon of any athlete at any position in any sport. He was, in pure leaping ability, a physical specimen whose measurables would have been remarkable at any position on any team at any level. He also had one of the fastest 40-yard dash times on the entire Louisville roster, a roster that included scholarship athletes at every skill position. Reported times suggested he ran in the 4.35 range, which is elite, even among professional skill position athletes. The physical profile, by any reasonable evaluation, was transcendent. In 2014, Bonifon started 5 games as a true freshman quarterback. He threw for 864 yards and 5 touchdowns. He rushed for 164 yards and 5 touchdowns, a number that was tied for the 3rd most rushing touchdowns by a quarterback in Louisville history. He posted a 4-1 record as a starter. He won his first career start against Wake Forest, going 16 for 32 for 206 yards. He threw his first career touchdown pass to Michael E. Harris. He led the team to a 28-6 victory over Syracuse, completing 12 of 22 passes for 174 yards and 1 touchdown. By every indication, he was the future of the program. He was the guy that Petrino had recruited to be the centerpiece of his offense for the next 3 years. The offensive system had been installed around his skill set. The wide receivers had been recruited to complement his throwing ability. The offensive line had been constructed to provide the kind of mobile pocket that a dual-threat quarterback required. Everything was being built around the Reggie Bonifon project. Then, in 2015, Bonifon started the season as QB1. He made the start in the season opener against 6th-ranked Auburn at the Georgia Dome in Atlanta, a nationally televised game that was supposed to be Bonifon's coming-out party. He went 8 for 13 for 67 yards before being pulled in the second half. The game was a 31-24 loss, with Jackson coming off the bench and providing more productive snaps. And then something happened that would change the trajectory of both his career and the entire Louisville program. Bobby Petrino made a decision. He decided to give more reps to a true freshman named Lamar Jackson. Over the course of the 2015 season, the reps gradually shifted from Bonifon to Jackson. until by the end of the year, Jackson was unambiguously the starter and Bonifon had been moved to wide receiver. The shift was not announced with a formal press conference or a dramatic public statement. It happened gradually through the accumulation of practice reps, through game snaps, through situational deployment decisions, through the thousands small moments that collectively constitute a coaching staff's answer to the question of who the starting quarterback is. By midseason, the answer was Jackson. By year end, the answer was unambiguous. And Bonifon's quarterback career, which had been projected to define a program, was effectively over. Now here's where the narrative gets complicated, and this is where most people's understanding of the Lamar Jackson story is fundamentally incomplete. Lamar Jackson was not recruited to Louisville as the next great quarterback prospect. He was recruited as a developmental dual-threat quarterback out of Boynton Beach Community High School in Florida. His recruiting profile varied wildly depending on which service you consulted. 247 Sports ranked him as the 12th best dual-threat quarterback in the class of 2015 and the 409th overall prospect nationally. ESPN ranked him as the 80th best prospect in the state of Florida. Rivals had him at 51st in Florida. He was, depending on who you asked, somewhere between a 3-star and a 4-star prospect. He was not in the conversation for 5-star status. He was not a consensus top 100 recruit. He was a raw, athletic, under-evaluated quarterback from a small Florida high school who had scholarship offers from Louisville, Florida, Auburn, Clemson, and several mid-major programs. His high school statistics were impressive, but not overwhelming by Florida standards. He passed for 3,033 yards and rushed for 2,440 yards across his junior and senior years, accounting for 80 total touchdowns. The production was excellent. The evaluation of the production by National Recruiting Services was tepid. The mismatch between the production and the evaluation is itself instructive. It suggests that the recruiting evaluation apparatus had difficulty assessing black dual-threat quarterbacks from smaller high schools whose throwing mechanics did not fit the pro-style template. Jackson was underrated because the template was inadequate to evaluate him, not because his underlying ability was genuinely modest. And here's the detail that matters most. When Jackson arrived at Louisville, he was not arriving as a savior. He was arriving as a developmental project. The starting quarterback was Reggie Bonifon. The system was already installed. The offense was already designed around the skill set of a dual-threat quarterback because that's what Bonifon was. And this is the crucial point. The Bobby Petrino offense at Louisville was not designed for Lamar Jackson. It was designed for the archetype that Bonifon represented. And when Jackson stepped into that system, the system didn't change. The player changed. The system stayed the same. And the system, because it was designed to maximize the output of an athletic dual-threat quarterback, made Lamar Jackson look like a Heisman Trophy winner. Let me say that again because it's the most important sentence in this entire section. The system was designed before Lamar Jackson arrived. The system was designed for Reggie Bonifon's skill set. When Lamar Jackson was inserted into that system, the system's pre-existing design amplified his abilities in ways that neither he nor the system could have produced independently. The transcendence was not in Jackson. The transcendence was in the confluence. The intersection of Jackson's specific athletic tools and Petrino's pre-designed system produced outputs that looked supernatural. But the system would have produced elevated outputs with any sufficiently athletic dual-threat quarterback. That's what systems do. That's what they're designed to do. And we know this because we have the counterfactual. We have Reggie Bonifon. Bonifon had a 43.5-inch standing vertical. Jackson's official combine vertical, measured years later at the NFL level, was not publicly recorded in any extraordinary way that would suggest a dramatic advantage over Bonifon's leaping ability. Bonifon had elite speed, reportedly running in the 4.35 range. Jackson's 40 time at his pro day was reported at 4.34, essentially identical. Bonifon was a dual-threat quarterback. Jackson was a dual-threat quarterback. The physical profiles were not identical, but they were in the same category. Both were the kind of athlete that Petrino's system was built to exploit. And here is the critical epistemological point. We cannot directly measure the counterfactual where Bonifon remained the starter through 2015 and 2016. We cannot observe the world in which Petrino kept Bonifon at quarterback and Jackson moved to wide receiver. But we can reason about that world based on what we know about the system and the athletic profile of the athlete who would have been operating it. And the reasoning strongly suggests that Bonifon, in that alternate timeline, would have produced statistics that were at minimum in the same general neighborhood as what Jackson ultimately produced. Possibly not quite as spectacular. Jackson's specific combination of burst acceleration, creativity in broken plays, and downfield throwing ability was exceptional, even relative to Bonifon. But Bonifon was not so far below Jackson athletically that the system, properly deployed, would not have generated a major Heisman candidate season from him. But here's what happened. When Jackson took over as the starter in 2015, Petrino moved Bonifon to wide receiver and running back. Bonifon spent the rest of his Louisville career as a skill position utility player. catching 10 passes for 105 yards in 2015, and eventually converting full-time to running back by 2016. He made the start at quarterback against Auburn, but was pulled in the second half, and that was essentially the end of his quarterback career. He graduated, went undrafted in the 2018 NFL Draft, and signed with the Carolina Panthers as a running back. He played 23 career NFL games, accumulated 197 career rushing yards on 32 carries, and scored one rushing touchdown, a 59-yard run, against the Jacksonville Jaguars in 2019 that accounted for more than half of his career NFL rushing yardage. He bounced between practice squads, injured reserve designations, and active rosters in Carolina and then Washington before his NFL career wound down around 2022. By the standards of professional football, his career was the career of a marginal contributor whose primary contribution was as a depth piece in a professional backfield. Think about the implications of this. Two athletes with comparable physical profiles. Same system, same coaching staff, same offensive scheme. One becomes a Heisman Trophy winner, the first in Louisville history, and a first-round NFL draft pick who goes on to win 2 NFL MVP awards. The other becomes an undrafted free agent running back who plays 23 career NFL games and accumulates 197 career rushing yards. The difference between their careers, measured in economic output, cultural significance, Hall of Fame trajectory, and historical legacy, is approximately the largest possible difference that can exist within a single profession. Jackson has earned over $250 million in contract value across his NFL career. Bonifon's cumulative NFL earnings were likely in the low 7 figures across 4 seasons, most of it league minimum salaries on non-guaranteed contracts. Jackson will be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Bonifon's NFL career will be a footnote that most football fans will never have read. And the difference between them at the point where their paths diverged was not a difference in underlying athletic ability so extreme that it justified this divergence. The difference was a coaching decision made by Bobby Petrino in the fall of 2015. The difference between Lamar Jackson's career and Reggie Bonifon's career is not primarily a difference in talent. It's a difference in timing, opportunity, and contextual deployment. Jackson arrived at the exact moment when Petrino was ready to fully commit to the dual threat system. Jackson received the starting reps, the game experience, the developmental attention, and the national stage that comes with being the starting quarterback at a Power 5 program. Bonifon received none of that because there's only one starting quarterback job, and once Jackson took it, Bonifon's career trajectory was permanently altered. This is the ruthless arithmetic of football careers. The starting quarterback position is a scarce resource. There is exactly one of them per team. When one player occupies it, every other quarterback on the roster is denied access to it. And access to the position is not merely about playing time. Access to the position is about everything downstream of the position. The media attention, the film study hours, the strength and conditioning prioritization, the pocket of offensive line blocking schemes constructed around the starter's tendencies, the play calling designed to maximize the starter's strengths, the team identity constructed around the starter's public persona. All of it flows to the starter. And the backup, whatever his underlying ability, is systematically denied these developmental inputs. Over 3 or 4 years of college eligibility, the cumulative effect of this differential treatment is enormous. The starter emerges as a polished, developed, high-floor professional prospect. The backup emerges at best as a prospect with significant uncertainty about his ceiling due to the lack of developmental reps. And this reveals the most uncomfortable truth about professional football talent evaluation. The difference between a Heisman Trophy winner and an undrafted free agent is not always a difference in ability. Sometimes it's a difference in circumstances. Sometimes it's a difference in who got the opportunity and who didn't. Sometimes it's a difference in which gatekeeper made which decision at which moment. Bobby Petrino made a decision in 2015. He decided that Lamar Jackson, not Reggie Bonifon, would be his starting quarterback. That decision was the fulcrum on which 2 entire careers pivoted. And while Jackson clearly distinguished himself once he received the opportunity, we cannot know what Bonifon would have done with the same opportunity. We cannot know whether the Petrino system, fully unleashed with Bonifon at the controls, would have produced comparable outputs. What we know is that the system was designed for Bonifon's archetype. And when Jackson, who fit the same archetype, was inserted into the system, the outputs were historic. The strongest defensible inference, given the shared archetype and the shared system, is that Bonifon, had he remained the starter, would have produced outputs in the range of what typical productive Power 5 dual-threat quarterbacks produce. Not quite as historic as Jackson's statistical peaks, but very good. Good enough, probably, to be drafted. Good enough, probably, to have an NFL career with some meaningful longevity. Good enough, probably, to be known today as a solid professional quarterback rather than as a footnote in the Lamar Jackson origin story. This is not to diminish Lamar Jackson. Jackson's individual ability is not in question. His 2016 season was extraordinary by any measure. He threw for 3,543 yards and 30 touchdowns, while rushing for 1,571 yards and 21 touchdowns. He won the Heisman by the largest margin in years. He was genuinely great. The question is not whether Jackson was great. The question is how much of his greatness was attributable to his own abilities and how much was attributable to the system that was already built to optimize athletes with his profile. And the answer, almost certainly, is both. His abilities were real. His abilities were necessary. But his abilities alone would not have produced the outputs he produced without the Petrino system to amplify them. The system was necessary too. And the system was not Jackson's system. The system was Petrino's system, designed for Bonifon, inherited by Jackson, and attributed retrospectively to Jackson as if he had invented it. He did not invent it. He inherited it. The inheritance was consequential. The inheritance was the gateway through which Jackson's ability passed in order to become what the world recognized as his greatness. And this principle, the principle that system design and coaching decisions create the conditions for individual transcendence, is the principle that Deion Sanders applied to Travis Hunter. Sanders didn't discover that Hunter could play both ways. Hunter had played both ways in high school. Every elite recruit has the athletic tools to contribute on multiple sides of the ball. What Sanders did was make the coaching decision to allow it, to design around it, to build a spectacle around it. And that decision, like Petrino's decision to start Jackson over Bonifon, was the gatekeeper's prerogative. Not the player's achievement, the gatekeeper's prerogative. The pattern connects across decades and across programs. Coaches make decisions. Decisions create conditions. Conditions produce outputs. Outputs generate narratives. Narratives generate legacies. And the legacies are attributed to the athletes whose bodies produced the outputs, not to the coaches whose decisions created the conditions that made the outputs possible. The attribution error is so consistent, so pervasive, so foundational to how we understand football that challenging it feels like challenging a law of physics. But it is not a law of physics. It is a convention of discourse. And the convention systematically overestimates the importance of the athlete and systematically underestimates the importance of the coach. This is not to diminish either Jackson or Hunter. Both are genuinely talented football players. The argument is not that they're frauds. The argument is that the concept of transcendence in football is itself a kind of fraud. A fraud perpetuated by a system that attributes to individual genius what is actually the product of systemic design, coaching decisions, opponent quality, and contextual positioning. Football doesn't have transcendent players. Football has transcendent contexts. And the coaches who create those contexts are the true architects of the myths we celebrate. The Reggie Bonifon counterfactual is the most important evidence we have that this is true. If athletic ability were decisive, if individual transcendence were real in the way the mythology claims, then Bonifon would have had a career that reflected his measurables. His 43.5-inch standing vertical would have been converted into a meaningful NFL career. His elite speed would have been deployed at quarterback or wide receiver in ways that generated Pro Bowl appearances. Instead, he had a marginal NFL career as a running back, with total career rushing yards that any replacement-level backup could accumulate in a single productive game. The gap between Bonifon's physical profile and Bonifon's career outcomes is so wide that it can only be explained by the structural mechanics of gatekeeping decisions rather than by any variable intrinsic to Bonifon himself. And if those mechanics determined Bonifon's career, they determined Jackson's career too. They determined Hunter's career. They determined every career at the highest levels of the sport. This is the Bobby Petrino Laboratory. It is a natural experiment preserved in the historical record that demonstrates the decisive role of coaching gatekeeping in the manufacture of athletic transcendence. Petrino's system was the laboratory. Bonifon was the first subject. Jackson was the second subject. The system treated them differently, and the differential treatment produced radically different outcomes from inputs that were, in their underlying physical dimensions, surprisingly similar. If you understand what happened at Louisville between 2014 and 2016, you understand why everything else in this essay is not just a reasonable interpretation, but a necessary one. The Heisman trophies are awarded to the outputs of systems. The NFL draft positions are determined by the outputs of systems. The cultural narratives of athletic greatness are constructed from the outputs of systems. And the systems are designed by coaches whose names are largely unknown to the public. The names we celebrate are the names whose bodies happen to be inserted into the right systems at the right moments. The names we forget are the names whose bodies were equally capable, but whose careers were derailed by the gatekeeping decisions that happened upstream of any opportunity to prove what they could do. Bonifon is one of those forgotten names. There are thousands of others, and the football mythology requires their forgetting in order to sustain its narrative of individual transcendence. Remembering them, looking at them clearly, understanding what happened to them, is the beginning of seeing the sport for what it actually is. We need to go deeper into the mechanics now. We've established the principle that context manufactures transcendence. Now we need to look inside the machine. We need to understand how specific formations, specific scheme designs, and specific personnel groupings create statistical outcomes that are then attributed to individual excellence. because the Travis Hunter case and the Lamar Jackson case are not isolated phenomena. They are symptoms of a systemic condition that pervades every level of football, from Pop Warner to the NFL. And that systemic condition is this: individual statistics in football are not measures of individual performance. They are measures of system output that are retroactively attributed to individuals. The stat sheet appears to record what each player did. What the stat sheet actually records is what each player was positioned to do by the system he was operating within. And the distinction between those two things is the difference between a sport that rewards merit and a sport that rewards contextual positioning. American football has consistently told itself the story that it rewards merit. The evidence suggests to anyone willing to look that it actually rewards contextual positioning. And the difference, once you see it, cannot be unseen. Let me walk you through a concrete example. Imagine a college defense running a 3-3-5 scheme. 3 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, 5 defensive backs. This is an increasingly common scheme at the college level because it allows defenses to match up against spread offenses with nickel and dime coverage packages built into the base defense. Now imagine that the 3 defensive linemen are all undersized, averaging 6'2", 270 pounds. They can hold the point of attack against lighter offensive linemen, but they get pushed around against bigger, more physical front fives. The 3 linebackers, by contrast, are well-recruited athletes with good instincts and adequate size. The defensive backs are a mix of developmental players and transfers. This is a plausible, realistic defensive personnel grouping for a Group of 5 program or a lower-tier Power 5 program. It's not a hypothetical. It's the kind of defensive group that fields 40 or 50 programs in any given college football season. In this scheme, what happens on a typical running play? The offensive line pushes the undersized defensive line backward. The running lanes open up between the tackles, and the runners hit the second level, the linebacker level, at full speed. The linebackers are the first unblocked defenders to make contact. This is not the linebackers' doing. This is the structural condition of the defensive front. The defensive line, by failing to hold the point of attack, has created a condition where the linebackers must make more tackles than they would make in a well-functioning front seven. The offensive line has reached the second level. The linebackers are forced to defeat blocks that, in a better designed front, would have been absorbed at the line of scrimmage. The linebackers, if they are competent athletes, will make many of those tackles, and they will accumulate statistics that suggest individual excellence. But the statistics are artifacts of the front 3 failure, not of the linebackers' transcendent ability. Now here's what the stats will show. The inside linebacker in this scheme will lead the team in tackles. He might lead the entire conference in tackles. He's seeing more ball carriers in his area because the defensive line isn't occupying them at the first level. Every run that gets past the line of scrimmage becomes his responsibility. And his tackle total reflects not his transcendent ability, but the structural failure of the front 3. At the end of the season, he will be named first team all-conference. Analysts will discuss him as a potential NFL draft pick. His name will appear on preseason All-American lists the following year if he returns. His high school alma mater will celebrate him. NFL scouts will begin evaluating his tape. Agents will begin reaching out. His personal brand will inflate in response to the statistical output. And all of this will be downstream of the defensive line failure that structurally inflated his statistical production in the first place. A scout who doesn't understand scheme design will look at this linebacker's stat line and see a tackling machine, a first-team all-conference performer, a potential NFL draft pick. And the scout might be right about the draft pick part, because the NFL drafts off of statistics as much as it does off of film. But the scout would be wrong about what the statistics mean. The statistics don't mean the linebacker is great. The statistics mean the scheme funnels production to the linebacker position by virtue of its structural weaknesses. And the NFL, when the drafted linebacker arrives in the league and is asked to make plays behind a professional defensive line that holds the point of attack more effectively than his college defensive line did, will discover that his statistical profile was overstated. He will underperform his draft position, his career will be modest, and the scouting industry will shake its head at another college producer who failed to translate to the pros. But the translation failure was predictable. It was baked into the evaluation. The statistics had been inflated by systemic conditions that no longer held in his new environment. The player is the same, the system is different, and the system was the active variable, not the player. Now imagine the opposite scenario. Same linebacker, same physical tools, same football IQ, but now he's playing behind a defensive line that includes a dominant nose tackle who commands double teams and a first-round edge rusher who disrupts plays in the backfield. In this front, the offensive line is occupied at the first level. Running backs are being tackled behind the line of scrimmage or at the line of scrimmage. Fewer plays develop to the second level, and the linebacker's tackle total drops dramatically. Not because he's worse, because the context changed. His statistics regress to mediocrity, his all-conference nomination disappears, his NFL draft stock evaporates. He becomes, in the eyes of the scouting apparatus, a player who was previously overrated, whose reduced production reveals the truth about his ability. But the truth about his ability has not changed. Only his context has changed. And the scouting apparatus, conditioned to read statistics as individual measures, misreads the contextual shift as a revelation about the underlying player. This is how football actually works. Statistics are outputs of systems. And the system design, which is entirely controlled by the coaching staff, predetermines the statistical distribution across positions and players. A coach who understands this can manipulate it. A coach can design a scheme that funnels production toward a specific player, inflating that player's numbers in ways that make him look like a star. A coach who wants a specific linebacker to get drafted in the second round can design a scheme that maximizes that linebacker's tackle opportunities, even at the cost of team-level defensive effectiveness. A coach who wants a specific pass rusher to accumulate sacks can design blitz packages that free that pass rusher against favorable protection schemes. A coach who wants a specific receiver to lead the conference in receptions can design passing concepts that target that receiver on high-percentage plays. In each case, the player gets the credit for the statistical output, but the statistical output is primarily a function of the coaching decisions that structured the opportunities. The player's contribution is not zero. The player has to actually execute. But the execution is the final step in a pipeline that begins with strategic decisions the player had no role in making. And this is precisely what Deion Sanders did with Travis Hunter. By putting Hunter on both sides of the ball, Sanders was effectively doubling Hunter's opportunity for statistical production. Hunter wasn't just getting cornerback snaps, he was also getting wide receiver snaps. His total snap count was dramatically higher than any other player on the field. And because snap count is the single strongest predictor of statistical production, if you play more snaps than anyone else, you will, almost by definition, produce more statistics than anyone else. This is not a controversial claim within football analytics. It is the baseline assumption of modern evaluation. More snaps equals more opportunities. More opportunities for a competent player equals more production. The relationship is near linear and highly predictable. A cornerback who plays 100% of defensive snaps will accumulate more tackles, more pass breakups, and more interceptions than a cornerback who plays 70% of snaps, even if the 70% player is measurably better on a per-snap basis. The snap count is the volume multiplier, and Hunter's snap count, because it aggregated offensive and defensive snaps, was functionally higher than any single position player on his team. Hunter's Heisman-winning season at Colorado in 2024 illustrates this perfectly. On offense, he posted 1,258 receiving yards and 15 touchdowns. On defense, he had 35 tackles, 4 interceptions, and 11 passes defended. These are excellent numbers on both sides of the ball, but they are not numbers that would independently win a Heisman Trophy. There were wide receivers with more yards. Tyroa McMillan at Arizona, for example, posted over 1,300 yards as a pure receiver. There were cornerbacks with more interceptions. Will Johnson at Michigan had a comparable defensive portfolio. What made Hunter's numbers Heisman-worthy was not their individual magnitude, but their cumulative spectacle. The fact that one player produced them on both sides of the ball was the story. The narrative was the Heisman case, not the statistics. If you separated Hunter's offensive and defensive contributions and presented them as two different players, neither of them would have won the Heisman. Together, as a single player doing both, they won the most prestigious individual award in college football. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts because the whole carried narrative weight that neither part alone possessed. And the narrative weight was the actual voting criterion, obscured behind the statistical totals, but clearly operative in the voting behavior of the Heisman electorate. And this brings us to the deeper point about formation as destiny. In football, your statistical output is not a measure of how good you are. It is a measure of how much opportunity the coaching staff has given you to produce. And the coaching staff's decisions about who gets opportunity and who doesn't are driven by a complex calculus that includes talent evaluation, system design, game strategy, political dynamics within the program, and, increasingly, media and narrative considerations. The player doesn't control any of this. The player shows up, does his job, and hopes that the gatekeeper, the coach, puts him in a position to succeed. And if the gatekeeper decides to put him in a position to look transcendent, then he will look transcendent, regardless of whether his underlying ability actually is transcendent. This is the machinery behind the myth. This is the formation as destiny. Let me illustrate this with another example, this one from the offensive side of the ball. In the mid-2010s, Oklahoma, under Lincoln Riley, produced 3 Heisman Trophy winners in 4 years. Baker Mayfield won in 2017, Kyler Murray won in 2018, Jalen Hurts finished second in 2019, a non-winning year for Oklahoma quarterbacks, but a near miss that completes the pattern. The pattern is extraordinary. 3 different quarterbacks with 3 different physical profiles, 3 different throwing motions, 3 different skill sets, all achieving the single most prestigious individual award in college football within a 4-year window at the same school under the same coach. The probability of this happening by chance, if each Heisman campaign were an independent event driven by individual quarterback talent, is essentially 0. The probability of it happening because the coaching system at Oklahoma during those years was specifically designed to produce Heisman-caliber statistical profiles for whoever occupied the quarterback position is, by contrast, very high. The pattern suggests that the system, not the player, was the Heisman-producing variable. The player had to be good, of course. A below-average quarterback could not have executed the offense well enough to win the Heisman, even with the system's assistance. But the system took average to excellent quarterbacks and converted them, reliably, into Heisman candidates. The system was the lever. The players were the weights being lifted, and the lever, properly used, could lift a range of different weights to the same altitude. Lincoln Riley moved to USC in 2022. His offensive system came with him. And lo and behold, the next quarterback in his system, Caleb Williams, won the Heisman in his first season at USC. Same coach, same system, new school, same result. The Heisman followed the coach. It did not follow the school. It did not follow any specific player. It followed the coach because the coach was the person controlling the variable that actually produced Heisman campaigns. That variable was the offensive system. And the system, deployed in any environment with any sufficiently competent quarterback, produced the statistical output that Heisman voters responded to. When Williams declined in his second season at USC, as the team's defensive failures exposed the offense to more difficult situations and forced Williams into more high-pressure throws against better coverage, his Heisman case disappeared. The coach and system were the same. The surrounding conditions had changed, and the statistical output, responsive to those conditions, declined accordingly. The Oklahoma case and the USC case demonstrate something that the Louisville case also demonstrates from a different angle. The coach is the upstream variable. The player is the downstream variable. The system is the pipeline. And the statistical output, which is what voters and scouts and media analysts respond to when they construct narratives about individual greatness, is the end product of a pipeline whose upstream variables are almost entirely controlled by coaching decisions. The player controls his own execution within the system, but the system itself, the play calls, the personnel groupings, the scheme design, the situational deployment, the media positioning, all of these are upstream of the player. And all of them are where the actual decisions that determine career outcomes are made. This is why the Travis Hunter case is not primarily a story about Travis Hunter. It is a story about Deion Sanders. Sanders controlled the system. Sanders made the decisions about Hunter's deployment. Sanders designed the scheme that gave Hunter his offensive touches and his defensive assignments. Sanders made the strategic choice to play Hunter both ways, when almost no other coach in America would have made that choice. Sanders pitched Hunter to the media as a two-way phenomenon, generating the narrative framing that elevated Hunter's statistical output into Heisman contention. Sanders, not Hunter, was the active decision-maker in every stage of the process that produced Hunter's Heisman and his second overall NFL draft position. Hunter's job was to execute the opportunities that Sanders created. He did execute them, competently and often excellently, but the opportunities themselves were Sanders' creation. Without Sanders, there would be no opportunities for Hunter to execute. And without the opportunities, the execution, however competent, would not have produced the statistical outputs that generated the narrative that led to the Heisman and the draft position. This is formation as destiny. The formation, meaning the scheme, the system, the deployment decisions made by the coaching staff, is the primary determinant of what statistical output any given player produces. The player's individual ability is necessary for execution, but is not sufficient for the output. The coach's decisions are the transformative variable that converts player ability into the specific statistical profiles that the football evaluation apparatus responds to. And because the coach's decisions are usually invisible to the public, because the coach is not the one making catches and tackles and throws, the credit for the statistical output flows to the player whose body executed it rather than to the coach whose decisions structured it. This misattribution is not accidental. It serves the interests of multiple stakeholders. It serves the players, who prefer to be celebrated for their individual brilliance rather than understood as executors of coaching strategies. It serves the coaches, who can take credit when their decisions produce Heisman winners while deflecting blame when their decisions produce disappointments. It serves the media, which can build narratives around individual protagonists more compellingly than around structural dynamics. And it serves the audience, which wants to believe that the excellence they're watching is primarily a function of individual human transcendence, rather than a function of opaque coaching decisions whose logic they cannot easily penetrate. But the misattribution, however convenient for all stakeholders, distorts our understanding of the sport at a foundational level. When we attribute to individual genius what is actually the product of systemic design, we misread the causal structure of the sport we claim to understand. We overrate the athletes whose coaching contexts were favorable and underrate the athletes whose coaching contexts were hostile. We construct historical narratives that are mythologically satisfying but factually misleading. And we fail to recognize the most important figures in the sport, the coaches whose decisions actually determine what the players on the field are capable of appearing to be. The coaches are the true architects of football. The players are the visible executors. The audience sees the executors and cheers them. The architects remain largely invisible, their contributions folded into the outputs of the athletes who were deployed to generate those outputs. This is the deepest distortion in how the sport is understood, and correcting it is the first step towards seeing what football actually is, rather than what the sport's own mythology tells us it is. Everything we've discussed so far about the manufacture of transcendence has a natural expiration date. That expiration date is the NFL, because the NFL, for all its flaws, for all its own mythologies and narratives and spectacles, operates under one condition that college football does not. In the NFL, everyone is good. In the NFL, the talent gap between the best players and the worst players on any given field is dramatically compressed compared to college football. In the NFL, you cannot hide behind scheme, you cannot hide behind opponent quality, you cannot hide behind narrative. The NFL is where context collapses and individual ability is revealed in something closer to its raw form. Not perfectly. Nothing about professional football is perfectly revelatory. There are still schemes that benefit certain players over others, coaches who make better decisions than others, franchises whose institutional competence varies widely, but the baseline talent level is compressed in a way that makes the scheme-dependent statistical inflation that characterizes college football much harder to execute. The NFL is the closest thing to a meritocracy that professional American team sports produces. And because it is closer to a meritocracy than the college game, it serves as the testing ground where the narrative inflation that characterizes college careers gets corrected against the discipline of professional competition. And this is why Travis Hunter's first NFL season is so instructive, because it tells us exactly what the data always suggested, that Hunter is a good football player who was made to look like a transcendent football player by the system Deion Sanders built around him. The first season is, as of this writing in April 2026, the only data we have. But it is enough data to make meaningful inferences about what the rest of the career will look like. Because NFL rookie seasons are predictive, they're not determinative. Players improve, players develop, players adjust. But the baseline established in year one is usually correlated with the career outcome. Players who dominate as rookies tend to have great careers. Players who struggle as rookies can recover, but the recovery is less common than continued struggle. And players who end their rookie season on injured reserve, especially with the kind of soft tissue issue that Hunter reportedly sustained, are at elevated risk for recurring durability problems that constrain their career output. Hunter was drafted second overall by the Jacksonville Jaguars in the 2025 NFL Draft. The Jaguars acquired the pick in a trade with the Cleveland Browns, giving up significant draft capital to move up and select him. Specifically, the Jaguars traded their 2025 first-round pick, 5th overall, their 2025 second-round pick, 36th overall, their 2025 fourth-round pick, 126th overall, and a 2026 first-round pick in exchange for the second overall pick, a fourth-round pick, 104th overall, and a sixth-round pick, 200th overall. The net cost of moving from 5th to 2nd was substantial. The Jaguars were not just paying the price of one pick, they were paying the price of roughly 3 first-round equivalent picks worth of future roster construction opportunities. The franchise was clearly investing in the narrative as much as the player. Hunter was supposed to be the kind of transformational, franchise-altering prospect that justifies trading away your future. The kind of player whose presence on the roster fundamentally changes the competitive calculus for a team that has struggled with consistency. The kind of asset whose value to the franchise exceeds the sum of the picks used to acquire him. In his first NFL season, Hunter played 7 games before being placed on injured reserve on October 31st, 2025. In those 7 games, he recorded 28 receptions for 298 yards as a receiver. His defensive statistics were modest. He was reportedly being used primarily as a cornerback with part-time wide receiver duties. The dual-threat, two-way mythology that had defined his college career was already being scaled back by an NFL coaching staff that understood what Deion Sanders either didn't understand or didn't care about. That in the NFL, against NFL-caliber athletes, playing both ways is not a competitive advantage. It's a durability risk. The injury that ended his rookie season was, as of the reports available, a knee issue. The details of the injury are less important than the pattern. The pattern is that a player being asked to absorb NFL-level contact on both sides of the ball is, structurally, at elevated risk of durability problems. That elevated risk converts into reduced availability, which converts into reduced production, which undermines the entire premise of the two-way deployment that justified his draft position. And the durability risk materialized. Hunter went on injured reserve after 7 games. The player whose entire brand was built on the idea that he could do more than anyone else proved, in the crucible of professional football, that doing more than anyone else has a cost, and that cost is physical. The human body, even a young, well-conditioned, professionally trained human body has limits, and those limits are reached faster when you're absorbing NFL-level contact on both sides of the ball. The Jaguars, by April 2026, have already announced that Hunter will be a full-time cornerback and part-time wide receiver going forward. The phrasing of the announcement is itself revealing. It is not a celebration of the two-way deployment that the team traded its future to acquire. It is a quiet retreat from that deployment, framed as a modified approach that preserves some element of the two-way identity while acknowledging that the full two-way identity is not viable at the professional level. This is the market correcting. This is the narrative deflating. This is the mythology meeting the reality of professional football, and the mythology losing. Now let's compare Hunter's first NFL season to Lamar Jackson's. Jackson was drafted 32nd overall in the 2018 draft, the final pick of the first round. He was not considered a top prospect. He was not considered a generational talent. He was considered a raw, athletic quarterback with questions about his ability to throw from the pocket. Some analysts suggested he should convert to wide receiver. Bill Polian, the Hall of Fame executive, infamously suggested on radio that Jackson should consider playing wide receiver at the NFL level rather than quarterback. The narrative around Jackson entering the NFL was almost the inverse of the narrative around Hunter. Jackson was underrated, doubted, questioned, positioned as a project who might not make it at his chosen position. Hunter was overrated, celebrated, protected, positioned as a generational talent whose success was a foregone conclusion. The first season reversed the narratives, as the NFL frequently does. Jackson took over as the starter in Week 11 after an injury to Joe Flacco. He went 6-1 as a starter and led the Ravens to a division title. He became the youngest quarterback to start a playoff game at age 21. And in his second season, he set the single-season record for rushing yards by a quarterback, threw 36 touchdown passes, and won the NFL MVP award unanimously. The underdrafted player outperformed his draft position by several orders of magnitude. The narrative, which had said he was a project, had been wrong. The measurables, which had said his athleticism would translate, had been right. And the underlying reality, that Jackson's combination of throwing ability and running ability was uniquely suited to the NFL game, when the NFL game had begun to embrace dual-threat quarterback play, was revealed over the course of his first 3 professional seasons. The difference between Jackson's NFL trajectory and Hunter's is not just a difference in individual ability, although Jackson is clearly the superior athlete and football player. The difference is also a difference in how the NFL contextualizes each player. Jackson entered the NFL and was given a system, the Greg Roman offense, that was specifically designed to maximize his dual-threat ability. The Ravens built an entire offensive identity around Jackson's unique skill set. They committed to it fully. They did not ask Jackson to play in a traditional drop-back passing scheme that would have suppressed his running ability. They built the scheme to his strengths, and the scheme amplified Jackson's abilities in the same way that Petrino's system had amplified them at Louisville. The pattern repeated at the professional level. The player who had the right system built around him produced historic statistics. The player whose system was not rebuilt around him had to adapt to what the league's conventional approaches allowed. Hunter, by contrast, entered the NFL without a system built around his supposed unique ability. The Jaguars did not redesign their entire offense and defense to accommodate a two-way player. They did what every NFL team would do. They treated him as a cornerback who could also play some receiver. And in that more conventional deployment, stripped of the spectacle and the narrative and the Sanders media machine, Hunter's production returned to what his measurables always suggested it would be: competent, useful, but not transcendent. The Jaguars could not reasonably have built a scheme around Hunter's two-way ability because doing so would have required restructuring their entire roster and strategic approach in ways that would have compromised their ability to field a competitive team. NFL rosters are built around the collective contributions of 53 players, each of whom has to produce within a system designed to maximize team-level outcomes. A single player, no matter how talented, cannot demand that the entire system be rebuilt around him, especially when the system rebuild comes with durability risks that could sideline him and render the restructuring worthless. This is the NFL as reality check. The NFL is where narrative dies and data lives. It's where a 43.5-inch vertical leap matters, and a compelling backstory does not. It's where 6 feet and 188 pounds is what it is, regardless of how many Heisman Trophy voters were enchanted by the idea of a two-way player. And it's where the gap between manufactured transcendence and genuine transcendence becomes measurable, quantifiable, and undeniable. Within the first year of a player's NFL career, the evaluation apparatus begins to calibrate. Coaches see what the player can actually do in practice against NFL caliber competition. Opponents game plan against the player and adjust to his tendencies. Teammates recognize where the player can contribute and where he cannot. The internal evaluation within the building often differs dramatically from the external narrative, and as the external narrative encounters the internal evaluation, which the external narrative does with delay but with inevitability, The gap between them becomes visible to the public. The NFL is not a perfect meritocracy. Narratives matter there too. Draft positions matter. Franchise-level investments in specific players produce organizational incentives to deploy those players in ways that justify the investment, even when the deployment does not optimize team outcomes. This is why overdrafted players often receive more opportunities than their performance justifies. The franchise has sunk cost in them. The franchise needs them to work out. The franchise continues to feature them beyond the point where feature-level usage is justified by their performance. This creates drag on organizational performance, but it also sustains narratives beyond their empirical expiration dates. Tim Tebow was featured longer than his performance justified because of the investment Denver had made in drafting him and the narrative value he provided. Johnny Manziel was featured longer than his performance justified for similar reasons. The franchises sunk more resources into justifying the initial investment than they should have, based on their own internal evaluations, because the narrative was too valuable to abandon too quickly. Hunter will face this dynamic. The Jaguars have invested enormous draft capital in him. They cannot easily admit, either publicly or internally, that the investment was a mistake. They will continue to feature him in prominent roles. They will continue to market him as a franchise cornerstone. They will continue to structure their roster and their media strategy around the idea that he is the kind of player the initial investment justified. But the gap between the marketing and the on-field reality will, over time, become increasingly visible. If Hunter's production continues at the level suggested by his first season, the narrative will erode. If he improves dramatically, the narrative will be preserved. The question is an empirical one, to be resolved over the next several seasons, and the resolution will depend on whether the underlying ability that his measurables suggest is consistent with continued league average to above average production, or whether he has an additional gear that the measurables do not predict. My empirical prediction, based on the analysis laid out in this essay, is that Hunter will produce at approximately the level his measurables predict. He will be a useful NFL player. He will have productive seasons. He may make a Pro Bowl or two, particularly if he focuses primarily on cornerback, and the league-wide talent at that position allows him to be recognized for his competent but not elite production. But he will not transform the Jacksonville Jaguars. He will not be the second-best player in his draft class, as his draft position implied. He will not be mentioned in Hall of Fame conversations in 10 years. He will be a solid professional whose career outcomes align with what the measurables always suggested. And the Jaguars will retrospectively be understood as a franchise that overpaid for a narrative asset, sacrificing future draft capital to acquire a player whose college production was inflated by coaching context in ways that did not translate to the professional level. This is the predictive power of understanding the context machine. If you understand that college statistics are artifacts of systemic conditions rather than measures of individual ability, you can predict which players will translate to the NFL and which will not. You look at the underlying measurables. You look at the opponent quality during the college career. You look at the scheme design and whether it was unusually favorable to the player's statistical profile. You look at the coaching context and whether the player was the beneficiary of gatekeeping decisions that amplified his output. And you make an informed prediction about how his professional career will unfold based on how much of his college production was individual versus how much was contextual. This analytical framework, properly applied, outperforms the conventional scouting narrative more often than the conventional scouting narrative wants to acknowledge. Lamar Jackson, by this framework, was underrated coming out of college. His statistics were inflated by Petrino's system, yes, but his measurables were also exceptional. And the measurables indicated that, even stripped of the favorable college context, he would produce at a high level at the professional level. The NFL's evaluation of Jackson was systematically miscalibrated, due in significant part to the racial templates and throwing motion biases that have historically penalized black dual-threat quarterbacks. The draft day correction of his evaluation, when his career quickly outperformed his draft position, was the NFL correcting a systematic error in its own evaluation framework. Travis Hunter, by contrast, was overrated coming out of college. His statistics were inflated by Sanders' deployment, his narrative was inflated by the cultural moment, and his measurables did not justify the franchise-altering draft capital that was invested in him. The NFL's evaluation of Hunter will correct in the opposite direction. His career will underperform his draft position. The correction will be slower and more painful than Jackson's was, because overdrafted players receive more chances than underdrafted players to prove themselves, but the correction will happen. The data will assert itself, the mythology will yield to the reality, and the NFL, as it always does eventually, will reveal what the college game had concealed, which is that the players who produced at college levels because of systemic amplification produce at professional levels at the levels their underlying abilities support, and not at the levels their inflated college statistics had implied. This is the NFL as reality. This is why the context machine's outputs have a shelf life. The college game is forgiving. The professional game is not. The college game rewards narrative. The professional game rewards execution, and the gap between them is the filter through which the manufactured transcendence of college football gets sorted into the durable careers of genuine transcendence and the dissolving careers of players whose greatness was always a function of the context their coaches had built around them. Hunter is not alone in this dynamic. The NFL every year absorbs new waves of college stars whose professional careers disappoint relative to the narratives they arrived with. The pattern is so consistent that it should, if the sport were honest with itself, lead to a fundamental revision in how college production is weighted in professional evaluation. But the sport is not honest with itself. The sport prefers its mythology. And so the pattern repeats, year after year, with different players at different positions absorbing the corrections that professional competition imposes on college-produced narratives. Hunter's correction will be one more data point in a long series of corrections, each of which should teach the evaluation apparatus something about its own biases, and none of which, historically, has produced durable updates to the evaluation methodology. The cycle continues. The next Heisman-winning two-way phenomenon will eventually appear, and the same mistakes will be repeated because the sport's incentives favor the repetition of the mistakes over the painful labor of reforming the evaluation apparatus that produces them. We've been building toward this argument for 7 sections, and now it's time to state it explicitly in its full, uncomfortable clarity. The argument is this: college football coaches are not talent evaluators. They are talent manufacturers. They do not discover transcendent players. They create the conditions under which players appear transcendent. And because they control the conditions, they effectively control which players make it to the NFL and which ones don't. The coach is the gatekeeper. And the gate is not a test of ability. The gate is a set of contextual decisions that the coach makes unilaterally, often based on factors that have nothing to do with the player's talent and everything to do with the coach's strategic interests, political dynamics, and narrative objectives. This argument, once accepted, fundamentally reorders our understanding of how athletic careers are made. It displaces the player from the center of the narrative and places the coach there instead. And it makes visible a power dynamic that American sports culture has invested enormous rhetorical energy in obscuring, because the obscuring serves everyone's interests except the players whose careers are determined by it. Let me break down exactly how this works, because the mechanics are specific and they are devastating to the mythology of meritocracy in football. The gatekeeping operates through 4 primary mechanisms, each of which is sufficient on its own to alter a career, and which in combination are functionally omnipotent over the outcomes they produce. The mechanisms are snap allocation, scheme design, situational deployment, and narrative access. Each is controlled entirely by the coaching staff. Each is invisible to the public. And each is routinely used by coaches to engineer specific career outcomes for specific players in ways that the evaluation apparatus of professional football has difficulty distinguishing from the underlying abilities of the players themselves. First, the coach controls snap allocation. In college football, there are approximately 60 to 70 offensive plays per game and roughly the same number of defensive plays. The coach decides which players are on the field for each of those plays. A receiver who plays 80% of offensive snaps will, all else being equal, produce dramatically different statistics than a receiver who plays 40% of offensive snaps. This is not a matter of talent, it's a matter of arithmetic. More snaps equals more opportunities equals more production equals more attention from NFL scouts. And the decision about who gets 80% and who gets 40% is made by one person, the coach. And the coach's decision is not always, or even usually, based purely on talent evaluation. The decision is based on a host of considerations that include talent evaluation, but also include the coach's personal preferences, the political dynamics within the program, the seniority of competing players, the recruiting obligations made to players during their recruitment, the strategic value of developing specific players for future seasons, and, increasingly, the NIL and transfer portal considerations that have made college football more transactional than ever before. Any of these considerations can override pure talent evaluation in snap allocation decisions. And the override is invisible to the public because the snap allocation decision is presented to the public simply as the depth chart, a seemingly neutral organizational artifact that conceals the decision-making process behind it. Second, the coach controls scheme design. As we discussed in the formation section, the offensive and defensive scheme determines how production is distributed across positions and players. A coach who runs a pass-heavy spread offense will produce receivers with inflated statistics. A coach who runs a ground and pound option offense will produce running backs with inflated statistics. A coach who designs his passing game around one primary target will create a receiver who leads the conference in receiving yards, not because that receiver is the best in the conference, but because the system is designed to feed him the ball. Scheme design is arguably the most consequential of the gatekeeping mechanisms because it is the most structural. Once the scheme is installed, it determines not just which players get more snaps, but which players' snaps produce more statistical output. A receiver in a pass-heavy spread offense who plays 80% of snaps will produce more statistics than a receiver in a run-heavy pro-style offense who plays 80% of snaps. The scheme amplifies or diminishes the player's output before the player ever takes the field. And the scheme decision is made by the coach, typically in consultation with coordinators, but ultimately subject to the head coach's approval. Third, the coach controls situational deployment. This is the most granular and the most powerful form of gatekeeping. The coach decides which players are on the field in which situations. A pass rusher who is deployed primarily on obvious passing downs, third and long 2-minute drill, known passing situations, will accumulate more sacks than a pass rusher who plays every down because obvious passing downs create more pass rush opportunities. A running back who is deployed in short yardage and goal line situations will accumulate more touchdowns than a running back who plays on early downs but is replaced near the goal line. A receiver who is targeted on third downs and red zone plays will accumulate more critical situation statistics than a receiver who is deployed primarily in between the 20s normal down and distance situations. And again, these deployment decisions are made by the coach, not earned by the player. The player does not choose when he goes in. The coach chooses. The coach's choices, aggregated across hundreds of situations across an entire season, construct the statistical profile that will be evaluated by NFL scouts. The profile is a coaching artifact. The player is the executor of the coach's situational deployment strategy, but the strategy itself is entirely upstream of the player's individual performance. Fourth, the coach controls narrative access. This is the least discussed and possibly the most important form of gatekeeping. The coach decides which players are made available to media. The coach decides which players are highlighted in press conferences. The coach decides which players are featured in promotional materials, highlight packages, and social media content. In the age of the transfer portal and NIL, a coach's media strategy can directly affect a player's economic value and career trajectory. A player who is consistently highlighted by his coach will receive more media attention, more NIL opportunities, and more NFL draft buzz than an equally talented player who is not highlighted. The narrative access mechanism is particularly consequential because it operates on the evaluation apparatus of professional football, not just on the statistical output that the apparatus observes. NFL scouts and general managers absorb the narratives that media constructs about college players. Those narratives influence, subtly or explicitly, how scouts evaluate the same player's film. A player who has been positioned in the media as a generational talent will have his film interpreted through that frame. Every good play will be seen as confirmation of his generational status. Every struggle will be seen as a minor setback rather than as evidence of limitations. The frame precedes the evaluation, and the frame is constructed by the coach's media strategy, not by any objective quality of the player himself. Deion Sanders understood all four of these gatekeeping mechanisms better than perhaps any college coach in history. And he deployed all four of them in service of the Travis Hunter narrative. He gave Hunter more snaps than any other player in the program, on both sides of the ball. Every game. He designed schemes that funneled production to Hunter on both sides of the ball. The offense was built to feature Hunter at receiver. The defense was built to feature Hunter at cornerback. The two schemes together constituted a double amplification of Hunter's statistical output that no other player in the country received. He deployed Hunter in the highest visibility situations, red zone targets on offense, critical coverage assignments on defense, special teams contributions, and game-breaking moments. Every situational deployment decision was calibrated to maximize Hunter's visibility and production, and he made Hunter the centerpiece of every media interaction, every social media post, every public appearance. The Hunter narrative was not something that happened to Sanders. It was something Sanders actively manufactured through hundreds of deliberate decisions across 3 seasons, each of which contributed to the cumulative narrative edifice that won Hunter the Heisman Trophy and elevated his draft stock to the 2nd overall selection. The result was a Heisman Trophy, a number 2 overall draft pick, and a multi-million-dollar NFL contract. And the question that nobody's willing to ask is this: how much of that outcome was Hunter's talent and how much of it was Sanders' gatekeeping? The answer, of course, is that it's both. You can't manufacture a Heisman Trophy winner out of nothing. Hunter is genuinely talented, but you also can't win a Heisman Trophy on talent alone. You need the context, the opportunity, the scheme, the snap count, the media machine, and the coaching decisions that create the conditions for a Heisman campaign. And all of those conditions were created by Deion Sanders, not by Travis Hunter. Hunter executed the opportunities that Sanders created. Sanders created the opportunities that Hunter executed. In any honest accounting, the credit for the Heisman should be distributed between them roughly equally. Instead, the credit is attributed almost entirely to Hunter, as if the opportunities he executed had appeared spontaneously in the world rather than being engineered by a coach whose strategic interests were served by their engineering. The misattribution is consistent. It flows from the sport's preference for narratives centered on individual athletic genius over narratives centered on structural coaching decisions. And the misattribution, because it is consistent, creates systematic distortions in how the sport understands itself. This is the gatekeeper thesis. And once you see it everywhere. You see it in every Heisman race, every draft class, every All-American team. You see coaches making decisions that elevate certain players and suppress others, not based purely on talent, but on strategic calculation, personal loyalty, media strategy, and the coach's own career interests. And you see the NFL drafting players based on statistical outputs that are, in significant part, artifacts of coaching decisions rather than measures of individual ability. The implications are unsettling. The most famous college players are not necessarily the best players. They are the players whose coaches made the decisions that elevated them. The draft order is not a ranking of talent. It is a ranking of accumulated narrative equity, much of which was constructed by coaches whose interests were served by the construction. And the careers that emerge from this process are careers shaped at their foundation by gatekeeping decisions that most fans of the sport do not recognize as the determining variables they are. Consider how this plays out across a single college team. A Power 5 football team has approximately 85 scholarship players plus a dozen or so preferred walk-ons who might earn scholarships. That's roughly 100 players on the roster. In any given season, perhaps 20 to 30 of those players get significant playing time. Perhaps 10 to 15 get the kind of featured roles that produce NFL draftable statistical profiles. Which 10 to 15, the coach decides. The other 70 players on the roster have similar athletic profiles to the featured players. They were recruited to the program because they were talented. They have put in comparable hours of training and preparation. They have the same access to the facility, the same coaching, the same competitive environment. The difference between the featured players and the non-featured players is not primarily a difference in underlying ability. It is a difference in coaching decisions about who gets featured. Those decisions are made based on a combination of talent evaluation, positional need, recruiting promises, political dynamics, personal preferences, and strategic calculations. The resulting roles are presented to the public as if they were the natural result of a meritocratic competitive process. In reality, they are the result of opaque decisions made by a small group of coaches with significant personal discretion over who emerges as a star and who fades into the background. Now multiply this dynamic across every Power 5 program. There are 65 Power 5 programs. Each of them has a similar structure. Each has a small number of featured players and a large number of non-featured players. Each has a coaching staff making decisions about who gets featured. The aggregate result is that each year, the NFL draft absorbs roughly 250 college players, of whom maybe 100 or so come from Power 5 programs. Those players are the ones whose coaches decided to feature them. They are not, by and large, the most talented 100 players in college football. They are the most talented among those who were selected for featured roles by their coaches. The difference is significant. The pool of players who could have been drafted, if their coaches had featured them, is probably several times larger than the pool of players who were actually drafted. The coach's decisions about featuring are the upstream filter. The draft is the downstream consequence. And the careers that flow from the draft are shaped by coaching decisions made years before those careers began. The transfer portal has modified this dynamic in some ways, but has not eliminated it. The portal allows players who were not featured at one program to seek featuring at another program. This is a meaningful expansion of player agency. But it does not solve the underlying gatekeeping problem. It simply allows players to search for coaches who will feature them. The coaches remain the decision makers. The players remain the seekers. The fundamental power asymmetry, where coaches have discretion over featuring and players must find coaches willing to exercise that discretion favorably, remains intact. And the portal has introduced new complications because the pool of playing opportunities has not expanded even as player mobility has increased, which means that more players are now competing for the same limited number of featured roles, with coaches holding even greater leverage than before over which transferring players they will accept and which they will pass on. The lesson of the gatekeeper thesis is that the NFL draft is not a meritocracy. It's a market for coaching outputs. Teams are not drafting the best players. They're drafting the players whose coaches gave them the best opportunities to produce. And the difference between a first-round pick and a fifth-round pick is often not a difference in talent. It's a difference in coaching context. This realization, once absorbed, has implications for how we think about everything from draft strategy to player development to salary negotiations. If statistical production is primarily a function of coaching context, then teams should value players whose production occurred in favorable contexts less, and players whose production occurred in unfavorable contexts more. The Lamar Jacksons of the world, whose college production was inflated by favorable systems, but whose underlying measurables also suggested genuine elite ability, are undervalued relative to what they actually produce in the NFL. The Travis Hunters of the world, whose college production was inflated by favorable systems and whose underlying measurables do not support elite NFL projections, are overvalued relative to what they actually produce in the NFL. Proper evaluation would require discounting the college production by the degree of contextual amplification and then projecting based on the measurables. Very few NFL front offices do this analysis rigorously. Most absorb the college narratives and use them as inputs to their draft evaluations, producing the systematic misallocations that the gatekeeper thesis predicts. There is one more dimension of the gatekeeper thesis that deserves attention because it has particular relevance to the racial politics that this essay has been navigating throughout. Historically, black athletes have been subject to more aggressive gatekeeping than white athletes at certain positions, particularly quarterback. The historical record shows a consistent pattern of black quarterbacks being moved to other positions early in their careers, of black quarterbacks being doubted at the NFL level, even when their college production was historically strong, of black quarterbacks being forced to prove themselves repeatedly in ways that white quarterbacks are not. This gatekeeping is, in some important sense, the reason the Lamar Jackson case is so politically loaded. Jackson was the beneficiary of a coach, Bobby Petrino, who made an explicit promise to Jackson's mother that her son would be allowed to play quarterback. That promise was, in the context of racial gatekeeping at the quarterback position, a significant exercise of coaching discretion against the historical template. Petrino opened the gate for Jackson that many other coaches would have kept closed, and Jackson's subsequent career, in which he has proven his elite quarterback ability against all the doubts that accompanied him, is a testament to what can happen when racial gatekeeping is overridden by individual coaching decisions. Jackson's success is both his own achievement and a reminder of how many other Jacksons in previous generations were denied the coaching decision that would have allowed their careers to unfold similarly. The gatekeeper thesis is intrinsically tied to the history of racial exclusion in American football. The gate has always been policed by coaches. The racial politics of the sport have always been, at their operational level, politics of coaching decisions about which bodies get to occupy which positions. Understanding this connection is essential for understanding what happened with Deion Sanders at Jackson State, with Travis Hunter on both sides of the ball, with Lamar Jackson in the pocket, and with Reggie Bonifant, who was never allowed to find out what his career could have been because the gate, for reasons having nothing to do with his ability, closed behind him when Jackson arrived on campus. If coaches are the gatekeepers of individual career outcomes, then media is the co-conspirator that converts gatekeeping decisions into economic value. And understanding how this conversion happens, the specific mechanics by which coaching decisions become narratives, become commercial assets, is the key to understanding why the Deion Sanders era at Jackson State generated the cultural footprint it did. Because the Sanders era was not primarily a football story. It was primarily a media story. The football was the raw material. The media was the processing plant. And the processing plant was what transformed the raw material into the finished product that consumers of American sports media encountered, discussed, and emotionally invested in. If you understand the processing plant, you understand the finished product. If you do not understand the processing plant, you mistake the finished product for a spontaneous phenomenon rather than as the engineered output of specific commercial and editorial decisions. Let me walk you through the media architecture that surrounded the Sanders-Jackson State Hunter phenomenon, because it is one of the most sophisticated operations of content manufacturing in the history of college sports. When Deion Sanders arrived at Jackson State in September 2020, he did not arrive alone. He arrived with an entire media infrastructure that had been cultivated over decades of his celebrity career. He had relationships with every major sports media outlet in the country. He had a personal brand manager. He had his own production company, Well Off Media, which had been producing content about him and his family for years before the Jackson State move. He had relationships with advertisers, agents, and television executives that predated his coaching career and that he brought with him as assets to his new role. And, critically, he had a pre-existing audience that was predisposed to consume content about him. Before he ever coached a down of football at Jackson State, there was already a content ecosystem waiting to be activated around whatever he did next. Smack Entertainment, the management company co-founded by Michael Strahan, orchestrated much of the Sanders media strategy at Jackson State. Smack is not a football organization. It is a talent management and content production company whose portfolio includes talent development, brand partnerships, and original content across multiple platforms. When Smack signed Sanders as a client and began shaping his Jackson State strategy, the calculation was not primarily about what was best for Jackson State. The calculation was about what would maximize the commercial value of Sanders' celebrity platform. Jackson State was the venue, Sanders was the talent, and the media strategy was designed to extract maximum value from the intersection of the two, with the beneficiary being Smack's client portfolio rather than the institutional development of Jackson State itself. This is not a critique of Smack. They did their jobs well. They are a talent management company. Their job is to maximize value for their talent. The fact that the value maximization strategy coincided with narratives of HBCU investment and racial progress was convenient but not essential to the underlying commercial logic. The media infrastructure that materialized around Sanders at Jackson State included ESPN, which dramatically increased its coverage of SWAC football specifically because of Sanders' presence. ESPN's decision to broadcast Jackson State games during the Sanders era was not a reflection of any newfound commitment to HBCU sports. It was a recognition that Sanders' presence at Jackson State generated the ratings that made HBCU broadcasting commercially viable for the first time in decades. When Sanders left Jackson State for Colorado, ESPN's interest in SWAC football declined accordingly. The ratings followed the celebrity, not the institution, and the institution, which had briefly benefited from the celebrity's presence, returned to its previous level of media visibility when the celebrity moved on. This pattern, where media interest in HBCU football proved to be a function of individual celebrity rather than structural commitment, revealed the underlying commercial logic that had driven the coverage in the first place. Media does not cover HBCU football because HBCU football is intrinsically valuable content. Media covers HBCU football when a celebrity's presence makes HBCU football commercially valuable to cover. The distinction is decisive because it explains why the coverage appeared and disappeared in patterns that tracked Sanders' career rather than tracking any institutional development of the HBCU programs themselves. The Barstool Sports partnership that developed during the Sanders era represented another dimension of the media architecture. Barstool is a content platform whose audience skews young, male, and engagement-seeking. Their interest in Jackson State was driven by the same celebrity-adjacent logic that drove ESPN's interest, but with a different editorial sensibility. Barstool's coverage emphasized the spectacle elements of the Sanders era, the personality-driven narratives, the social media moments, the viral incidents. This coverage reached audiences that traditional ESPN broadcasts might not have reached, further expanding the commercial footprint of the Sanders-Jackson State operation. And again, this coverage was a function of the Sanders presence rather than of any independent commitment to HBCU content. When Sanders left, Barstool's interest in Jackson State content evaporated. The coverage had been an investment in the Sanders celebrity, not in the SWAC or in HBCU football as a category. And the investment was amortized over the duration of Sanders' tenure and then terminated when the underlying asset, the celebrity's physical presence at the institution, was transferred to Colorado. The advertising activation that accompanied the Sanders era is worth examining in detail because it reveals the commercial incentives that drove the entire media ecosystem. Procter & Gamble, through Walmart, became a significant partner of the Jackson State program during Sanders' tenure. This partnership did not happen because Procter & Gamble had a strategic commitment to HBCU development. It happened because Procter & Gamble recognized that the Sanders-Jackson State narrative provided an efficient vehicle for reaching African American consumers at a moment of elevated cultural salience around Black institutional visibility. The activation was a brand strategy, not an institutional investment. The dollars that flowed through the partnership served primarily to generate brand affinity among the consumer audiences whose engagement Procter & Gamble was purchasing, with a secondary benefit to Jackson State as the venue that hosted the activations. When Sanders left for Colorado, the efficient vehicle status transferred with him. Procter & Gamble's activations around Sanders-driven properties continued at Colorado. Jackson State's activations declined. The commercial value had always been attached to Sanders, not to the institution. The transfer of value when Sanders moved simply revealed where the value had been located all along. Aflac, Home Depot, Gatorade, and dozens of other major brands ran activations tied to the Sanders persona during his Jackson State tenure. Each of these activations generated short-term revenue for Jackson State, but the long-term brand equity being built accrued to Sanders personally. The brands were investing in the Sanders platform. Jackson State was the venue where the Sanders platform operated. When the platform moved, the brand investments moved with it. This is not an arrangement that produces institutional transformation. This is an arrangement that produces individual wealth accumulation around a celebrity who happens to be using an institution as his operational base for a limited period. The institutional residue from the Sanders tenure at Jackson State was largely cosmetic. New facilities investments were announced, but many were limited in scope. Recruiting infrastructure was upgraded, but not to levels that could sustain elite recruiting in the post-Sanders era. The athletic department's revenue spike during the Sanders years proved to be a temporary phenomenon that did not translate into durable competitive advantages once Sanders departed. The attendance figures at Jackson State home games, which had peaked at over 42,000 per game during the Sanders era, declined in subsequent seasons to levels more consistent with the program's pre-Sanders baseline. And here's where the media co-conspirator dynamic becomes most revealing. The media did not cover this collapse in the way that it had covered the initial rise. When attendance declined, when ratings dropped, when the narrative machine that had been so active during the Sanders years fell silent, the media did not publish retrospective analyses of what had actually been built versus what had been represented. The narrative machine did not have an interest in this kind of retrospection. The narrative machine had monetized the rise. It had no commercial interest in monetizing the fall, and so the fall happened quietly with minimal coverage as the narrative machine redirected its attention to the next content opportunity that emerged, which, in this case, was Sanders at Colorado, where the same commercial logic reestablished itself in a new venue with a new set of activation partners and a new narrative arc whose commercial value was, once again, to be extracted and distributed across the media ecosystem rather than retained by the institution that hosted the spectacle. This is the media as co-conspirator in the most precise sense of the term. The media does not simply report on the spectacle. The media participates in the construction of the spectacle. The media's editorial decisions about what to cover, how to frame what is covered, and whose perspective to center in the coverage all shape the spectacle that audiences encounter. A Sanders arrival at Jackson State, covered as a cultural phenomenon, generates different reader and viewer responses than the same arrival covered as a personnel decision at a mid-tier FCS program. The framing is itself a manufacturing process. It converts the raw material of events into the finished product of narrative. And the framing is driven by the commercial incentives of the outlets performing the coverage, which are aligned with the commercial incentives of the celebrity whose presence drives the audience engagement, which are aligned with the commercial incentives of the management company orchestrating the media strategy. The alignment is tight. The alignment is functional. And the alignment produces outcomes that serve all the aligned parties while leaving the parties outside the alignment, primarily the institution hosting the spectacle and the audience consuming it, with costs that are not proportionate to the benefits they receive. The audience, it should be emphasized, is not a passive victim of this arrangement. The audience actively participates in the construction of the narrative. The audience does the emotional labor of investing the events with meaning. The audience amplifies the coverage through social media engagement. The audience purchases the merchandise, the streaming subscriptions, the pay-per-view packages that capitalize on the narrative. The audience is paying for the experience of watching the spectacle. And the payment, in both direct commercial transactions and in the attention that supports the commercial ecosystem, flows through the media infrastructure into the pockets of the celebrity, the management company, and the advertisers whose activations depend on audience engagement. The institution, the team, the university receives only a small fraction of this flow. Most of it goes to the parties who were better positioned to capture value from the spectacle they were jointly manufacturing. Sanders' own media production, through Well-Off Media, is worth attention as its own dimension of the media architecture. Well-Off Media produced behind-the-scenes content about the Sanders program at Jackson State, distributed primarily through YouTube and social media channels. This content had its own audience, its own engagement metrics, and its own monetization. The production company was effectively a content arm of the Sanders Celebrity platform, operating inside the Jackson State program, but for the benefit of the Sanders personal brand. When Sanders moved to Colorado, Well-Off Media moved with him. The production infrastructure was never really Jackson State's. It was always Sanders. And the content it produced, however much it featured Jackson State facilities and Jackson State players, was always in service of the Sanders brand rather than in service of any institutional mission. The fact that Jackson State players appeared in Well-Off Media content during their years at the program did not generate any lasting economic value for them. The content ecosystem captured their images and their stories and monetized those captures for the benefit of the production company, which was an asset of the celebrity who employed them as football players. This arrangement raises questions about consent and compensation that are only beginning to be addressed in the NIL era, but that were operating at full intensity throughout the Sanders tenure at Jackson State without significant scrutiny. The relationship between media and coaching in contemporary college football has evolved in ways that make the Sanders operation at Jackson State a template rather than an anomaly. Coaches now understand, in ways that coaches in previous generations did not, that media presence is a core component of their job. Recruiting is a media function, program branding is a media function, donor cultivation is a media function, NIL facilitation is a media function. A coach who cannot manage the media dimensions of the modern college football ecosystem is a coach who will be outcompeted by coaches who can. And the coaches who manage media most effectively are often coaches who have the pre-existing celebrity infrastructure to do so. Sanders brought 35 years of media experience to Jackson State. Most coaches do not have that experience. Most coaches must build media capability from scratch, learning on the job, making mistakes that more experienced media operators would not make. The gap between coaches with strong media capability and coaches without it has become a determinative factor in program success. And the gap itself is not primarily a function of coaching ability. It is a function of the coach's relationship to the media ecosystem, which is frequently inherited from pre-coaching careers rather than developed through coaching itself. This produces a paradox that American college football has not yet fully grappled with. The best coaches, in terms of conventional coaching metrics like schematic knowledge, player development, and game management, are often not the same coaches who are best at media. And the coaches who are best at media, who can translate their programs into the kind of commercial assets that attract NIL dollars and recruiting successes, are often not the coaches with the deepest conventional coaching expertise. The result is a market selection process that favors media-capable coaches over conventionally expert coaches, even when the media-capable coaches produce worse on-field outcomes than their conventionally expert counterparts would produce in the same roles. The modern college football coaching profession is reorganizing itself around the centrality of media. And this reorganization is happening without much public discussion, because the incentives that drive it benefit the stakeholders who would have to raise the discussion publicly, and those stakeholders have no interest in illuminating the dynamics that produce their own advantages. Deion Sanders is the apex of this reorganization. He's the coach who most completely integrates celebrity, media, and football into a single operational platform. His competitors at the highest levels of college football include coaches who have attempted to emulate aspects of his approach without the underlying celebrity infrastructure that makes his approach effective. Lincoln Riley at USC has attempted to build a media-forward program. Mario Cristobal at Miami has attempted a similar approach. Brian Kelly at LSU has attempted, with less success, to translate his previous program's media approach to a new environment. Each of these coaches has discovered that media-forward coaching requires infrastructure they don't possess at the levels Sanders does. Each has achieved partial success at best. The model is imitable in structure, but not in execution, because the execution depends on celebrity infrastructure that most coaches cannot acquire. And the infrastructure that Sanders possesses is not something he built as a coach. It is something he imported from his pre-coaching career. The competitive advantage, in other words, is not primarily a coaching advantage. It is a celebrity advantage being deployed in a coaching context, which returns us to the original observation that this essay has been building throughout. Sanders at Jackson State was not a football phenomenon. It was a celebrity phenomenon operating in a football venue, and understanding the celebrity dimensions of the phenomenon is essential to understanding what it was, what it did, and what it left behind. Let us now engage in an exercise that the sports media apparatus almost never engages in honestly. Let us look at Travis Hunter's body with precision, without sentiment, and without the protective narrative coding that normally surrounds discussions of his physical profile. This is not an attack on Hunter, it is a measurement exercise, and the measurements, when allowed to speak for themselves, tell a story that is dramatically different from the story the narrative machine has constructed around him. At the 2025 NFL Scouting Combine, held at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis, Indiana, in February 2025, Travis Hunter measured in at the following dimensions: height, 6 feet and 3/8 of an inch, officially recorded as 6003, meaning 6 feet 0 inches and 3/8 of an inch. Weight, 188 pounds. Arm length, 31 and 3/8 inches. Hand size, 9 and 1/8 inches. These are the verified numbers. They are not disputed. They are on the official NFL Combine record. And they are, collectively, a profile that should give any serious football evaluator pause before projecting Hunter as a franchise-altering talent at either of his nominal positions. Let us evaluate these numbers against the NFL positional distributions where Hunter is expected to compete. At wide receiver, the average NFL starter measures approximately 6 feet 2 inches and 212 pounds. Hunter is 2 full inches shorter and 24 pounds lighter than the positional average. Against NFL cornerbacks, the average measures approximately 6 feet 0 inches and 196 pounds. Hunter is at the average height, but 8 pounds below the average weight. Neither profile suggests a player with a transcendent physical advantage over the players he will be competing against. The profile suggests, instead, a player whose physical dimensions place him near the lower boundary of what the NFL considers viable at either position. Players can succeed with profiles near that boundary, and many do, but they succeed through exceptional technique, exceptional football intelligence, and exceptional consistency, not through athletic domination of the opponents they face. Hunter will need to demonstrate these non-physical advantages in order to justify his draft position. The physical dimensions alone do not justify it. The 40-yard dash, the single most important speed measurement in the pre-draft evaluation process, was not run by Hunter, not at the Combine, not at Colorado's Pro Day. There is no official 40 time on record for Travis Hunter. Consider the weight of this absence. For decades, the 40-yard dash has been treated as a near-mandatory component of skill position prospect evaluation. Receivers who run slower than expected have their draft stock downgraded. Cornerbacks who fail to break 4 to 5 are flagged as coverage liabilities at the professional level. Every prospect entering the NFL draft knows that the 40 is the single most visible and most consequential physical test they will perform. And every prospect who has a meaningful draft stake in the outcome of their pre-draft evaluation runs the 40. They run it at the combine, where the conditions are standardized and the times are verified by NFL operations. They run it at their pro day, where the conditions favor them and the times are friendlier. They run it twice, 3 times, as many times as it takes to establish a publishable number that evaluators can factor into their assessments. Hunter did not run it. This is not a minor detail. This is a data point of extraordinary evidential weight. A player who declines to run the 40 is making a specific statement to the evaluation community. The statement is that the player believes the 40 time he would produce would be less favorable to his draft stock than the 40 time that evaluators would assume in the absence of a measurement. Think about the implications of that reasoning. In the absence of a measurement, evaluators will make assumptions. Those assumptions will be drawn from the player's game film, his positional profile, and his perceived athletic ability. If the player believes that evaluators are overestimating his 40 time based on these other inputs, then running the 40 would produce a downward correction. And downward corrections on the 40 hurt draft stock. Therefore, a player who believes his actual 40 time is slower than the perceived 40 time has a rational incentive to not run. The refusal to run, in other words, is usually a signal that the player and his representation believe the actual time would disappoint the evaluator expectations. This is not absolute. There are players who decline to run the 40 for other reasons. Injury concerns, strategic decisions by the agent, a desire to preserve the player's peak physical condition for the rookie season itself. But these reasons are the minority case. The majority case, when a high-profile player declines to run the 40, is that the player and his team have made the calculation that the measurement would not help his draft stock. Deion Sanders, functioning as Hunter's de facto spokesman during the pre-draft process, offered a variety of justifications for the non-participation. He spoke about Hunter having nothing to prove. He spoke about Hunter's film speaking for itself. He spoke about the intelligence of preserving Hunter's health for the rookie season. Each of these justifications is plausible on its surface. None of them is the justification that would have been offered for a player whose 40 time would have been elite. A player whose 40 time would have been elite runs the 40. Because running the 40 with an elite time produces additional value for the player's evaluation. The fact that the decision was made to not run suggests, with high probability, that the internal expectation within the Hunter camp was that the time would not be elite. Now let us reason about what Hunter's actual 40 time probably is. Based on game film, based on his movements against college competition, based on the gestalt of his athletic profile, as revealed in 3 years of Power 5 and FCS tape, the realistic estimate for Hunter's 40 time is somewhere in the 4.45 to 4.50 range. That would place him in the below average category for wide receivers, where the average NFL starter runs approximately 4.50 or faster, and in the average category for cornerbacks, where the average NFL starter runs approximately 4.48. Neither range suggests transcendent speed. Both ranges suggest a player whose speed is adequate for his positions, but not a competitive advantage over the players he will be facing. Combined with his below-average size at receiver and his average size at cornerback, this speed profile paints a picture of a player whose physical tools are workmanlike rather than elite. Workmanlike tools can support a long NFL career. Workmanlike tools cannot support a franchise-altering career. The gap between these two outcomes is the gap between Hunter's draft position and Hunter's realistic career ceiling. The best comparable NFL wide receiver based on Hunter's measurable profile is Devonta Smith, the Philadelphia Eagles receiver who measured 6 feet tall and 170 pounds at his own combine. Smith is 3 inches shorter than Hunter, but within the same general weight range and positional profile. Smith has had a productive NFL career, averaging around 1,000 receiving yards per season across his first 4 years in the league. He has made 1 Pro Bowl. He is a useful, consistent professional receiver. He is not a transcendent player. He is not in the conversation for best wide receiver in the league. He is a high floor, moderate ceiling contributor whose value to his team is real but not franchise altering. If Hunter's NFL career tracks the Smith profile, he will have been a decent investment for the Jaguars, though not a second overall pick caliber investment. If Hunter underperforms the Smith profile, which is possible given the additional developmental complications of his two-way deployment history, he will have been a significant reach at the second overall position. On the defensive side, the best comparable for Hunter's measurable profile is a player like Xavier Howard or Jerry Alexander, both of whom measured in the 6 foot to 6'1" range with weights in the 190 range. Both have had productive NFL careers. Alexander has made 2 Pro Bowls. Howard has made 4 Pro Bowls. Both are considered good but not transcendent cornerbacks in their primes. This range of outcomes, Pro Bowl caliber but not best in league, is the realistic range for Hunter on the defensive side. If the Jaguars focus him primarily at cornerback, as they have announced they will, his career projection is probably a multi-time Pro Bowl cornerback with good coverage skills and solid playmaking ability. A useful player. A player who justifies a first-round investment. But a player whose draft position, second overall, represents an overpay when measured against the production he is likely to deliver. This is the honest evaluation, and it is an evaluation that the sports media apparatus has systematically declined to make. Instead, the apparatus has emphasized the narrative elements of Hunter's profile, the Heisman Trophy, the two-way usage, the cultural significance of his college path, as if those elements were substitutes for the measurable physical dimensions that actually predict NFL success. They are not substitutes. They are complements. A player with elite measurables and strong narrative presence has the highest upside. A player with elite measurables and weak narrative presence has strong upside, but may be underrated. A player with weak measurables and strong narrative presence has upside that is limited by the measurables, regardless of how compelling the narrative is. Hunter falls into this third category. His narrative is compelling, his measurables are limiting, and the NFL, over the course of his career, will gradually reveal which of these inputs dominates the outcome. The measurables will dominate. They always do. Narratives win Heisman trophies, measurables win NFL Pro Bowls, and the intersection of these two dynamics is where Hunter's career will be lived, with the narrative carrying him through his rookie contract and the measurables determining what his second contract looks like. There is one more consideration that deserves attention, which is the racial dimension of how physical evaluations are conducted in American football. Historically, black athletes have been subject to excessive emphasis on physical measurables, to the exclusion of the cognitive and technical dimensions that actually determine professional success. This critique is legitimate and well documented. But the opposite error, attributing transcendent physical ability to black athletes whose measurables do not support the attribution, is also an error. It is an error that flatters the athletes in the short term, but that sets them up for career outcomes that do not match the expectations that were set for them. The Hunter case is an example of the second error. Hunter has been described in terms that suggest transcendent physical ability. His actual measurables do not support this description. The gap between the description and the measurables will manifest, over his career, as a gap between expectations and outcomes. The outcomes will disappoint the expectations. And the disappointment will be, in part, a consequence of the narrative machine having oversold the player's physical profile to audiences that were willing to accept the oversell, because it served emotional needs that were more powerful than the evaluative needs the oversell obscured. The most intellectually honest way to discuss Hunter's physical profile is to describe it accurately. He is 6 feet tall and 188 pounds. He has adequate but not exceptional arm length. He has below average hand size, almost for his positional expectations. His 40 time is uncertain, but probably in the 4.45 to 4.50 range. His vertical jump and broad jump were not measured at the combine, so additional data on explosive power is unavailable. His change of direction ability, based on game film, appears to be good but not elite. His ball skills are strong, his technique at both positions is solid, his football intelligence appears to be above average. This is a complete, accurate description of a first-round NFL prospect. It is not a description of a second overall pick generational talent. The Jaguars paid the price for the second description. They will get the first. The difference between those two evaluations is the cost of believing the narrative rather than reading the measurables. And the cost, for Jacksonville as a franchise, will be measured in several years of suboptimal roster construction decisions that could have been avoided if the evaluation apparatus had been more disciplined about separating narrative from data. The broader lesson of the Hunter measurement exercise is that the evaluation apparatus of American football has built-in biases that favor certain narratives over accurate data interpretation. These biases are not primarily racial, though racial dynamics interact with them in complex ways. The biases are primarily narrative. Evaluators, like everyone else, respond to compelling stories, and a player whose story is compelling receives evaluation benefits that a player with a less compelling story does not receive, even when the underlying measurables are comparable. This dynamic produces systematic errors in talent evaluation, errors that compound across hundreds of decisions per draft cycle, and that collectively distort the market allocation of roster resources across NFL franchises. The franchises that discipline their evaluation processes against these biases, that force their evaluators to rely on measurables and production in context, rather than on narrative framing, will over time outperform the franchises that do not. This is not a hypothesis. It is the observable pattern across the history of NFL front office performance. The front offices that have been most successful at building sustained contenders have been the front offices most rigorous about separating narrative from data. The front offices that have struggled have been the front offices most susceptible to narrative inputs. And the franchise that traded up to draft Travis Hunter second overall has, regardless of what its internal self-understanding is, revealed itself to be in the second category rather than the first. The resolution of this bet will play out over Hunter's career, but the odds were unfavorable to the Jaguars from the moment the pick was made, and the measurables are the record that documents why. Now, we need to talk about something that the HBCU discourse almost never talks about with the precision it deserves. We need to talk about what the FCS actually is, what the talent gap between FCS and FBS football actually is, and what it means for a recruit like Travis Hunter to have spent time in the FCS before transferring to the FBS level. This is a conversation that the emotional architecture of the HBCU narrative makes difficult, because any discussion of the FCS talent level risks being interpreted as a dismissal of HBCU football or as a denigration of the players who compete at that level. That is not the intent. The intent is precision. The intent is to understand accurately what the structural conditions are at the level of college football where the Sanders-Hunter phenomenon began, because those structural conditions are essential to understanding what Hunter's production during his Jackson State year actually means and what it does not mean. The FCS, or Football Championship Subdivision, is the second tier of Division I college football. It comprises approximately 128 programs organized into 13 conferences, including the Southwestern Athletic Conference, where Jackson State competes. FCS programs operate with 63 scholarship players compared to the 85 scholarship players allowed at FBS programs. This scholarship differential is the single most important structural fact about the talent gap between the two subdivisions. A program with 85 scholarships can recruit, develop, and deploy a dramatically deeper roster than a program with 63 scholarships. The depth differential manifests not primarily in the starting lineup, but in the quality of backups, the quality of special teams contributors, and the ability to absorb injuries without catastrophic degradation in performance. An FBS program can afford to redshirt developmental players, rotate starters to manage fatigue, and maintain position battles that produce continual improvement through internal competition. An FCS program with 22 fewer scholarships cannot afford any of these luxuries. Every scholarship matters, every practice rep matters, and the roster is thinner, less developed, and more vulnerable at every tier. The talent gap extends beyond scholarship counts. FCS programs have smaller recruiting budgets, smaller facility investments, smaller strength and conditioning staffs, and smaller support infrastructures. They cannot compete with FBS programs for the top recruits. The recruits who do sign with FCS programs are, with rare exceptions, players who did not receive FBS scholarship offers, or players who received only low-tier FBS offers and chose the FCS program for specific reasons, often geographic or family-related. The pool of talent entering FCS programs is, on average, dramatically less nationally ranked than the pool entering FBS programs. This is not a statement about the individual talent of any specific FCS player. Some FCS players are genuinely talented and will make NFL rosters. It is a statement about the aggregate talent level. On any given FCS team, the number of players who possess NFL-caliber physical tools is typically small. On a top FBS program, it can be 20 or more. The density of professional-caliber talent on the field varies dramatically between the two levels. When Travis Hunter arrived at Jackson State in 2022, he was, by a significant margin, the most highly ranked recruit in the history of FCS football. His 5-star profile, his number 1 national ranking, and his measurable skill set placed him at a level of talent that the SWAC had never seen. The competition he faced during his Jackson State year, at both offensive and defensive snaps, was competition that was, on average, dramatically below his level. SWAC cornerbacks, on average, would not have received scholarship offers from Power 5 programs. SWAC wide receivers, on average, would not have been in the conversation for elite FBS programs. The defensive backs covering Hunter when he played receiver were, by and large, below average, even by FCS standards, because the SWAC is not a top FCS conference. The receivers Hunter covered when he played cornerback were, by and large, below average, even by FCS standards, for the same reason. Hunter was operating in an environment where his talent level was several standard deviations above the average talent level of his opposition. This is the most important contextual fact about his Jackson State production. Let us think carefully about what this means statistically. When a player's talent level is several standard deviations above the average talent level of his opposition, that player will, almost by definition, produce statistics that look dominant. This is not a measure of transcendent ability. It is a measure of the talent differential. A 440 receiver can produce spectacular statistics against 4'6" cornerbacks. A physical cornerback with NFL caliber coverage technique can blanket receivers whose route running is barely developed to the FCS level. Every matchup Hunter encountered at Jackson State was a matchup he was measurably better prepared to win than his opponent was prepared to compete. And the aggregate effect of winning almost every matchup, play after play, game after game, is a statistical profile that looks generational. But the statistical profile is primarily a function of the matchup quality, not of Hunter's individual ability. If you dropped Hunter into a Power 5 program and had him play the same schedule of SWAC opposition, his production would be comparable. If you dropped any average Power 5 cornerback or wide receiver into Hunter's role at Jackson State, that average Power 5 player would have produced statistics that were dramatic, though probably not as dramatic as Hunter's. The scale of the talent differential was so large that any Power 5 player would have looked very good. Hunter looked extraordinary because he was already a very good Power 5 caliber talent deployed against FCS competition that was several tiers below his level. This is why Hunter's transfer to Colorado was so consequential for the legitimacy of the narrative. The Jackson State year had produced spectacular numbers, but the numbers were against opponents whose quality was not comparable to what Hunter would face at the highest level. The Colorado year was the first time Hunter faced genuinely competitive talent on a consistent basis, and when he did, his production, while still very good, was recalibrated. He did not produce historically unprecedented numbers at Colorado. He produced numbers that were consistent with what a very good Power 5 wide receiver and cornerback would produce. The Heisman he won at Colorado was, as we have discussed, awarded primarily for the narrative of his two-way usage rather than for statistical dominance. His Power 5 numbers, evaluated against other Power 5 numbers at the same positions, were very good but not dominant. Tatairoa McMillan at Arizona had more receiving yards. Will Johnson at Michigan had a comparable defensive profile. The award was given for the story, not for the numbers, and this is the crucial realization about HBCU football as a staging ground. The Sanders-Hunter operation at Jackson State was not a test of whether elite talent could succeed at HBCU programs. It was a test of whether elite talent could generate sufficient media spectacle at HBCU programs to make the detour commercially viable before moving on to the Power 5 level. The answer, clearly, is yes. The spectacle was generated, the commercial value was captured, and the move to the Power 5 was executed when the media capital accumulated at the HBCU level had reached its peak. Hunter's HBCU year was not an investment in Jackson State as an institution. It was a staging ground for the launch of a Power 5 career that would ultimately be the real trajectory of his football life. The HBCU year provided the narrative foundation. The Power 5 year provided the competitive validation. The NFL draft provided the commercial payoff. And the HBCU, which had served as the staging ground, was left with the memory of having briefly hosted a player whose real career trajectory was always pointed elsewhere. There is a harder truth underneath this analysis. The truth is that the FCS, including its HBCU component, does not produce many NFL players under normal conditions. Looking at historical draft data, HBCU programs collectively have produced a small fraction of all NFL draft picks over the past several decades. In most recent drafts, 2 to 4 players from HBCU programs are selected, out of a draft that includes over 250 total selections. The odds of being drafted from an HBCU are dramatically lower than the odds of being drafted from a Power 5 program. This is not a function of individual player ability. Some HBCU players are genuinely talented. It is a function of the structural conditions that make it difficult for HBCU players to be evaluated by NFL scouts at the same level of scrutiny that Power 5 players receive. Scouts have limited time. They prioritize programs where the density of NFL caliber prospects is highest. HBCU programs, with rare exceptions, do not have that density. And so the scouting attention that would be required to identify and evaluate the HBCU players who do possess NFL caliber ability is not consistently provided. The players who would otherwise have NFL careers are missed or are drafted lower than their ability would warrant, or go undrafted entirely and have to fight their way onto professional rosters as undrafted free agents. The structural disadvantage is real, persistent, and systemic. The structural disadvantage is exactly what the Sanders-Jackson State operation appeared to challenge. By bringing a 5-star recruit to an HBCU, Sanders was ostensibly demonstrating that HBCU programs could compete for elite talent, but the demonstration was contingent on his personal celebrity, which was not transferable to other HBCU programs. When Sanders left Jackson State, the recruiting advantage he had provided left with him. The HBCU ecosystem did not structurally benefit from his presence in ways that would persist after his departure. The benefit was his personal capacity to attract recruits, which he retained when he moved to Colorado and which he no longer provided to any HBCU program. The HBCU movement that the Hunter commitment had seemed to catalyze did not generalize. No other 5-star recruit followed Hunter to an HBCU. No other Hall of Fame coach followed Sanders to the SWAC. The apparent revolution was, in retrospect, an idiosyncratic event tied to a specific individual's specific celebrity, with no structural replication mechanism to sustain it beyond the duration of his tenure at the institution. The HBCU football ecosystem, as of this writing in 2026, is roughly in the same structural position it was in before Sanders arrived at Jackson State. The programs are underfunded relative to FBS programs. The scholarship counts are capped at FCS levels. The recruiting competition with Power 5 programs remains unfavorable. The media coverage has retreated to pre-Sanders levels. The television revenue is minimal relative to Power 5 contracts. The alumni giving spikes that Sanders' presence produced have subsided. The net effect of the Sanders tenure on the long-term structural position of HBCU football is difficult to distinguish from zero. Some individual programs, Jackson State in particular, may have slightly improved facility investments or marginally enhanced recruiting infrastructure as a result of the attention during Sanders' tenure. But these improvements are modest and do not fundamentally alter the structural gap between HBCU football and the Power 5 level. The gap remains, and it remains, because the gap is not primarily a function of talent recognition, but a function of systemic resource allocation, conference realignment history, television contract geography, and the racial and economic disparities that have characterized American higher education funding for generations. Addressing these structural gaps would require interventions that operate at the structural level. Redistributing television revenue, revising scholarship allocation rules, revising conference alignment to increase exposure for HBCU programs, directing state funding toward HBCU athletic departments, building consortium arrangements that allow HBCU programs to share resources and coordinate scheduling. None of these interventions were pursued during the Sanders tenure. The spectacle Sanders generated was at the individual program level, focused on Jackson State specifically, and did not translate into policy advocacy or structural reform efforts. The spectacle was Sanders' career. The spectacle was not a movement, and the conflation of the two in public discourse allowed the spectacle to substitute for the movement, which meant that when the spectacle ended, the movement, which had never actually been built, ended too. There is one more dimension of the HBCU staging ground analysis that deserves attention. The players who were at Jackson State during the Sanders tenure, the players whose football careers intersected with the Sanders era, were genuinely affected by the experience. Some of them gained media exposure and NIL opportunities they would not have received at other FCS programs. Some of them gained connections to Power 5 programs through Sanders' network when they entered the transfer portal. Some of them had coaching relationships with Sanders that may extend beyond the Jackson State years and may continue to benefit their careers. These individual benefits are real. They are not zero, but they are distributed very unevenly across the Jackson State roster during the Sanders years. A small number of players, most visibly Travis Hunter and the Sanders sons, captured most of the benefits. The vast majority of the roster did not capture significant benefits. Their experience of the Sanders era was primarily the experience of playing on a team that was receiving media attention, which is a different experience than being the individual recipient of the media attention that the team was receiving. The attention aggregated at the celebrity level, the benefits aggregated similarly, and the players who were not at the celebrity level received a fraction of the benefits that would have accrued to them if the attention had been more broadly distributed across the roster. This is characteristic of celebrity-driven operations in any field. The celebrity captures the value generated by the platform. The platform's other participants, who contribute labor and attention to the celebrity's project, capture smaller fractions of the value in proportion to their visibility within the operation. The Jackson State roster, in this model, was the supporting cast for the Sanders production. Hunter was the featured player. The Sanders sons were the co-stars. The remaining 70-plus players on the scholarship roster were the ensemble. Ensemble members benefit from being part of a successful production, but their benefit is categorically different from the benefit captured by the featured cast. Most Jackson State players during the Sanders era did not transfer to higher levels of football. Most did not receive meaningful NIL income. Most did not secure NFL opportunities. Their college experience was marked by their proximity to a celebrity operation whose value extraction was concentrated among a small subset of the program's participants. This distribution of benefits is not unique to Sanders. It is characteristic of how value flows in celebrity-anchored enterprises, but it is important to name it accurately because the narrative that the Sanders tenure at Jackson State benefited HBCU football conflates the benefits captured by individual celebrities with the benefits captured by the broader ecosystem. The benefits were not broadly distributed. The narrative implied that they were. The implication was flattering to the narrative. It was not accurate to the underlying distribution of value that the narrative concealed.